Mr. Chairman.
All right, Mr. O'Loughlin.
Yes, sir.
Are you ready to carry on?
Yes, sir.
Very good. Yes, Mr. Millett.
Yes, Mr. O'Loughlin, thank you for coming back to us. Going back to the briefing that you had with Andy Walton and Mike Dowden, at any point during that briefing, did you have a discussion about the viability or the continuing viability of the stay-put policy or advice?
Not about stay put, no. We talked about generally the people in the building, but because they had limited information about the people in the building other than fire survival guidance, so I didn't have a conversation about the stay put guidance.
Right. Did it? Did you have a discussion or any thoughts yourself about whether or not that advice to stay put should be revoked?
So my thoughts would have been that there's people within that within the building who are staying in their flats because they're in a safe environment at that point in time, and for that reason, there's no reason to expect that if the smoke, heat or fire isn't affecting them, why they shouldn't be safe where they are. So there was no point I considered changing the stay put for the people who are unaffected in the flats now.
Right. Did it occur to you that although people might be unaffected for the time being, the speed of spread of the fire and the violence of its behaviour which you had observed meant that although somebody might be safe for the time being, they might not stay safe for very long?
So different people in the building could be affected differently, yes. So for example, if there's people on the southwest side of the building that's completely unaffected, at that point in time, my expectation would be that they'd be safe within their flats. There was no reason to expect the fire to go around the outside of the building to them, and there was no reason to expect it would go through the communal areas to them. So within those flats, for example, I would expect them to be safe to stay where they are. Other flats that in different areas, so the north-east side, for example, was being directly affected by the fire, heat and smoke, so I would expect those people, which were probably the majority of fire survival guidance calls, to, if they can escape, to leave their flats.
Right. So did you have any thoughts at that time about partly revoking the stay put advice and getting somebody to tell control that whoever called from flats on that side of the building that they should get out at all costs?
So I think the flats on that side of the building, so I didn't think about calling control, but that's on flats on the side of the building. If they've been affected by the smoke in particular, I would expect they're being told to leave if they can already, because that's the procedure they should follow. So with regard to stay put, as the people who are unaffected, my expectation was that those unaffected should be safe where they are, or safer at that point in time, because at that point in time we don't know the conditions of the staircase. So I could be taking them from an unaffected environment, so a smoke-free environment, and putting them into a smoke-filled staircase without knowing the details about those people. So when we talked about abilities earlier, for example, I wouldn't know if somebody who's in a safe flat is then being asked to go down a smoke-filled staircase when actually they've got either disabilities or some sort of vulnerability to the smoke that may be in that staircase.
Yes. And I think you told us before, at that stage, you didn't actually have any clear, or indeed any, understanding about what the conditions were inside the staircase or the lobbies outside those flats.
I hadn't had a briefing on what the conditions were.
Therefore, you had no means of assessing whether or not a safe exit was possible.
The means of assessing it was to then put in the fire sector commander who could find out what those conditions were and let me know. But the information wasn't available to me other than going into the building, which I didn't have the time to do.
Did you have any information or any understanding about the layout of the building at that point?
Not in detail. So this sort of building I've been to before, so my expectation was it's got a central core, which is where the lifts are, and then the flats are normally on the outside of that central core, normally with either 4 or 6 flats on each floor, and normally they have a single staircase with the dry rising main outside, and then the fire lift, the dry rising main would then be in the lobby. So I've been to that type of flat before, but I wouldn't have known the exact layout.
No. Did you ask for any plans?
I didn't ask Mike for any plans, no.
Did you ask if there was a premises information box?
I didn't ask that, no. My expectation is they found the premise information box, they would have passed that information to me, but I didn't ask for it specifically, no.
Is there a reason why not?
No, I just didn't consider it at the time. I think your expectation is if there's a premise information box or plans, then you're handed over to you. So I think if they'd have had them, they would have given them to me, but I didn't ask for them.
Right. Now, at the bottom of page 11, I just want to turn away from this topic for the moment and come and look at something a bit more specific, and I'll come back to your strategy shortly. At the bottom of page 11 of your statement, you say, and it's 3/4 of the way down the page. After the briefing, I headed back towards the command unit with Mark. We walked some of the way together down Grenfell Road, but at some point he left and went elsewhere. And you then say, I saw a command unit had arrived on Grenfell Road, but it wasn't yet operating. Do you know where he went?
No, I don't. No. So I recall that at the end of the briefing, Mike and Andy headed towards the tower, and then Mark went with me. But it could have been for a very short distance. It may have only been 5 or 10 metres that Mark was with me for, because the majority of Grenfell Road I walked down on my own. But I don't know where he went to now.
Right. Okay. Then I want to ask you just a little bit before that to look at something slightly higher up the page. During the briefing, you say, with Andy and Mick, I'd asked Mark Kentfield to send a series of messages for me, saying that I was in charge, that I wanted pumps increased to 40, FRUs increased to 6, so that I had more EDBA to have 4 aerials present. I also asked for additional officers, specifically 6 station managers and 4 group managers. And then you go on to say that you increased the number of command units to 4 to ensure I had enough command unit staff. So there's quite a lot in that. Now, my first question is, if you thought the fire was only on the exterior, why did you need to increase the makeup of FRUs to 6?
No, so the fire that I could see was on the outside of the building.
Yes.
But my expectation, based on the fire survival guidance calls and what the callers were saying, was that there would be either fire or smoke getting into some of those flats on the upper floors or on the floors. So I had no detailed knowledge from Andy or Mike about where the smoke or fire was on those floors, but from the fire survival guidance calls, my understanding was that there was either fire or smoke in some of the flats.
Right. And why 6 in particular? Why not?
6 FRUs.
Yes.
So on a quick calculation, that gives me at least 24 EDBA wearers. Once I took off the emergency crew of 2, that gives me 22, which is 11 crews of 2. So that's a lot of EDBA wearers. So it's a good start, shall we say, on the EDBA resources. So I've done a calculation of what that would give me and how long that would last for.
Right. And what would 11 crews of EDBA wearers allow you to do?
So their task would, I expect, would be to go into the building to the higher floors and to rescue people.
Right. Did you, go back to the briefing, I'm sorry to do this, go back to the briefing, did you have a discussion with Mike Dowden about what he had done with any EDBA crews that were already there?
I didn't have a discussion with him about EDBA, but my understanding was only one FRU there, so he'd have only had one EDBA crew available to him. So even if he had deployed, it was a limit to what they could have done. I didn't have the specific discussion.
Did you know that he had tasked an EDBA wearing crew, which was the only EDBA crew then present, to go to the roof level to set up a lines operation and try and facilitate some kind of drencher system to try to extinguish the fire on the exterior from above?
No, I don't recall that being handed out to me.
Right. You don't recall that?
No.
Okay. Did Mike mention anything to you about what he'd done with the EDBA crew present?
If he did, he may have said he sent them to an upper floor, but I specifically don't recall anything about an EDBA crew going onto a roof.
Okay. Now, coming back to the briefing and your request to Mark Kentfield to send a series of messages, do you remember when during your briefing you asked Kentfield to do that? To send
at the very early stages. So it was, Mike might not even been there. It was when I'd taken over from Andy, and then Andy went to get Mike. Right. And it was probably either as Mike arrived or around that time. So it was very early on in the briefing because I knew that I'd wanted the resources. But I had taken over.
Right. And what did Mark Kentfield do?
He wrote them down on a pad that he had with him, the normal clipboard that the command unit teams normally carry with them.
He wrote them down. Did he immediately call the command unit and pass those messages to the command unit to send?
I didn't see him on his radio, but that's not to say he wasn't.
Right. And then I think you said that Mark Kentfield stayed with you for the whole briefing.
As I recall it, yes. I recall Mike and Andy much more clearly because they were the two I was talking to, but I recall Mark being there to my left-hand side during the briefing.
Right.
I don't think he left during the briefing. I think he was there for all of it, which would be normal because in case I need anything else sent or requested. So that's my recollection.
Well, that's why I took you to the bit where you said after the briefing I headed back towards the command unit with Mark. Does that rather tell us that he did stay there throughout that briefing?
Yeah, my recollection is he was there until the end of the briefing, and then he came with me for maybe a few metres and he went off in another direction.
Right. Having written down the messages that you wanted him to send on his notepad at the start of the briefing, did you observe him actually communicating either with the command unit or with control to send those messages as you had instructed him?
He wouldn't have communicated with control. It would have been the other command unit, the command unit he would have talked to. He would have done that on his radio. I wouldn't have been listening to him using his radio. I some vague recollection that he was listening in on the radio or maybe talking on it, but I can't remember him specifically. And he, most likely, if he was doing that, he probably would have stepped away from us because we were trying to talk, and as I say, it was so noisy in the environment we were in that having him standing right beside us and talking over us would have been unhelpful. So if he did, he would have probably stepped away from us for a metre or two.
Right. After the briefing, and you left with him to go back to the command unit, were you satisfied that he'd sent those messages that you'd asked him to?
There was no reason to think he wouldn't have done that.
Did he tell you he had?
No, he didn't, no.
Right. Now, we know those messages weren't sent.
That's right.
And I think you only discovered that they didn't go the next day.
No, that's not correct, no.
Is that not correct?
No, I think in their entirety I didn't realise they hadn't gone. I think when I went back to the command unit I asked the radio operator on there if he'd spoken to Mark and if Mark had given him the messages that needed to be sent. And he said that he'd not heard from Mark, but he tried to get hold of him.
Right. And if you go to your contemporaneous notes, just to follow that up, you say, I think, under paragraph 11 on page 2, in the second paragraph, I confirmed with the CU team that my requests for appliances and officers made to Mark were being actioned, and they indicated that they would check.
So that wasn't a team, that was just the radio operator on CU8.
Yes. Do you remember who that was?
Dan Merrick, I think it is. I'm not sure I knew it was Dan Merrick on the night. I know since then it's Dan Merrick.
All right, fair enough. Did Dan Merrick check and come back to you in response to your request to him?
Dan was very, very busy with phone calls and radios. He said he'd get hold of Mark and check. And then when I next spoke to Dan, he said that he'd not been able to get hold of Mark still. So that's when I then sent the assistant messages for the FRUs and the command units and the other appliances.
Right. So you discovered when you got back to CU8 and had that conversation with Dan Merrick that actually Mark Kenfield hadn't sent those messages?
That's right, yes.
I see, okay. And do you have any idea why Mark Kenfield didn't send those messages?
No.
Okay. Did the fact that he didn't send those messages have any effect on the speed at which resources you had ordered got to the incident?
It would have meant that they were delayed by whatever length of time it was from me being under the tower to when I got them sent on by Dan.
Right. Now, we've got, I think, some idea of what the make-ups were that were ordered. We know that pumps were made 40, in fact, by Group Manager Welch at 203.
That's correct.
And we know that at 2:11:46, 6 FRUs were ordered.
Yes.
I mean, if you'd like me to show you the SIL, I can do that. But
No, I'm aware that I ordered 6 initially.
Now, was that FRU's 6 your order or Group Manager Welch's order?
That was mine as well.
That was yours. Why? Because you told Merrick to send it, did you?
Yes.
Right. And
I think they came at the same time as I asked Dan to send that. I'm Incident Commander as well, if I recall correctly.
yes. Now we have an order for 4 aerials, first being ordered at 2:32:01. Is that time familiar to you?
If it's on the log, then yes.
It is. It's page 23. I can show it to you if you like, but perhaps you'll just look at it to be clear. If you go to page 23 of the short incident log, at 2:32:01, to see just 3 entries down from the top of the page, Sharon Darby sends a make-up message, IUP CU8 make aerials 4. You see that?
Yes.
Does that accord with your recollection on the night?
It feels like it should have been earlier, but I have no doubt the log's correct.
Right. And do you know who ordered those?
It would have been me.
That's yours?
Yes.
So that would have been about a 20 or 30 minute delay, would it? Between you actually first asking... Well, let's try it a different way. How long do you think it would be between your first asking Mark Kentfield to order 4 aerials and the order actually being processed by Sharon Darby?
That does look around 20 minutes, yes.
Right. Do you think that had an effect on the resources getting to the scene?
It would have affected the resources getting to the scene. I think my thoughts at the time was that we would not be able to get 4 aerials to work on that building anyway, because you didn't have the access to it. So I think I might have asked Mike about aerials and you couldn't get them in. So my thoughts on the aerials, normally the best thing to do with them is ask the drivers what they think they can do with them when they arrive, because they tend to be the ones who know what to do. So yes, it would have been delayed, but I don't think we would have had the opportunity to use all 4 of them anyway.
Right, so I think I know the answer to this, because I think you might just have given it to me, but what was the point of ordering 4 aerials if you didn't think you'd be able to get them in?
So I'm not an aerial operator, so an aerial operator might be able to arrive and work out a way that they could either get access to the building, or they wouldn't normally, we may be able to move cars or move street furniture out of the way, for example, to get the aerial into the position you need it. And so the best person to judge that is the aerial operators. So quite often you'll order it to then let them decide if they think they can do what you'd like them to do. In this instance, for example, one of them got to work on the grass, which they normally wouldn't do, but it's a risk that we were obviously going to take that night.
And what was the highest reach of a water jet operated from the top of a basket of an aerial?
So the highest areas we have are around 30 metres.
Yes.
If that monitor's working, it would depend on the angle you've got the aerial pitch to. I would expect it, so that would take you approximately to about the 10th floor.
Yes.
And I would then expect a monitor to maybe go 2 or 3 floors above that. So I expect about the 13th floor, but I can't say I've ever tested that, as it were.
Was there, at that time, a piece of equipment in the possession or control of the LFB which would apply a jet higher than the 12th or 13th floor?
Not that I'm aware of, no.
Was there a piece of equipment in the possession of a nearby fire and rescue service which would get above the 12th or 13th floor?
I think later in the incident we ordered on Surrey's aerial appliance.
And how high did that go?
I can't recall. It probably was around the 13th or 14th floor, I think, because they couldn't get that close to the building at that point in time because of the debris field that was at the bottom of the east side of the tower. So, but how high it could get on a different day, I don't know.
And why didn't you order that straight away?
I didn't know Surrey had an aerial that was particularly that long.
Who discovered that?
I don't know. It was mentioned to me during the night that Surrey had, I think, contacted us and asked if we wished to use their aerial, and it was ordered on. And then it came within my operational area of command, so I got it to work in my area, but it wasn't something I was aware of.
Right. Is there a system in the LFB for working out what other neighbouring fire and rescue services have by way of equipment that LFB perhaps doesn't have, such as this aerial?
We work with neighbouring brigades on cross-border working, so we would have understood. It's more likely actually that we send our aerials out of London to support other fire services. I've not known a situation where we've had to request an aerial from another brigade, so who should have had the understanding that this aerial was available from Surrey? I don't know the answer to that.
No. Do you know where it's based, this aerial? Or was?
I don't. My expectation it's possibly their headquarters area, which is Reigate, but it might not be. I don't know where it's based in Surrey.
Do you, tell me if you don't know the answer, do you know why Surrey have got this super high aerial, but the LFB don't?
I don't know the answer to that, I'm afraid.
Okay. Now, you also ordered, I think, 4 CUs. That was at 20805.
Yes.
Was that you?
Yes.
Okay. And that again was through Dan Merritt, was it?
Yes.
Okay. Now, we know that Group Manager Welch declared a major incident, and he did that at 020608. Sorry, 38. 020638. That's page 21 of the SIL. You don't need to see that. My question is, did you consider declaring this a major incident yourself?
I considered it, yes.
Why didn't you do it?
My intention was to do it when I got on the command unit once I'd... So the key bit about the major incident message isn't just sending the message, which is like an alert, if you like, to the Category 1 and Category 2 responders. It's more thinking about what you want from that. And at that point in time, I knew what I wanted from a fire service point of view, but I hadn't fully thought through what I wanted from a police and ambulance point of view. So I wanted to think that through for a minute or two before I sent that message.
Right. So, and you then presumably discovered that Group Manager Welch had done it?
That's correct.
And Do you know whether he went through the same thought processes that you were going to go through, but didn't?
I don't know if he went through the same thought processes, but the message is useful in that it alerts those other services, but the key part is thinking about what you actually want as an incident commander. So the key bit for me there was the three priorities, I suppose, were the police, the ambulance and the hospitals. And that's the bit I needed a little bit of time to think about, and that couple of minutes back to the unit gave me that time to think about what I needed from the other services.
Yes. Now, you let Mark Kenfield go, as it were, on the way back to the CU. You don't know where he went, as you've just told us. Do you know what his role was? Did he give you any impression of what he was actually doing?
He was the team leader for the command unit.
Yeah. And why was he out on the incident ground? Do you know?
It's normal for the team leader to be out on the incident ground, either with the incident commander or in another way supporting the incident commander. So my expectation is he would have been with the incident commander prior to my arrival, and then if the incident commander goes to the command unit, the team leader would normally go with them. So the team leader is the liaison, if you like, between your command unit team and the incident commander.
Did you see him or hear him taking FSG information from the command unit?
I didn't, no, but like I said, when I was talking with Andy and Mike, he was a little bit away from us doing something on his radio or other things, but he wasn't part of that conversation. I wasn't listening to what he was doing, and I wouldn't have been able to hear him either.
Right. Now, if you go to page 11 of your statement, at the very foot of the page, you say, I continued on towards the command unit on Bowmore Road. As I walked, it gave me time to think about how I was going to manage and structure the incident. I'd already decided to stick with the National Incident Command System, NICS. I decided that I'd divide up the building as we would if it were a much smaller high-rise fire, and maintain the structures I've practiced and used many times. Although we'd not practiced for this type of incident within a council-style block, we had practiced for a similar event within Canary Wharf-style buildings where FSGs were occurring, where there had been phased evacuations, falling debris, and impacts on local infrastructure such as transport systems. First, can you just tell us what is the NICS system?
National Incident Command System, so it was introduced probably around 2005, 2006, and the idea was to standardise how fire and rescue services operated in a command way. So the same terminology, the same tabards, the same sectorisation, and a number of other aspects of how you command an incident.
Right. And to the best of your knowledge, are those systems encapsulated in incident command policies and procedures at the LFB, such as Policy 238?
Yes, they are.
Right. Secondly, can you just tell us a little bit about the Canary Wharf style building that you refer to? When was the exercise, the Canary Wharf style exercise you refer to there?
Probably around 2013, I think.
Right. So post-Lacanau.
Post-Lacanau, yes. Yeah.
And what did it involve?
So it was a high-rise fire in a building similar to Canary Wharf, but it wasn't using that name. It was a fire on a high floor, so above, so I can't remember the floor, maybe it would have been sort of 20 or 30th floor or above. And it was involving a fire that had affected that floor and I think a second floor as well. And then along the way, fire survival guidance calls, there was debris falling from the building, and a number of other sort of aspects for the situation.
Was that exercise a residential block or a commercial block?
It was a commercial tower block.
I see. And how many fire survival guidance calls were introduced as part of the exercise?
I can't recall exactly, but it would have been less than 10, probably more than 5, so somewhere around that.
Okay, and you say you were drawing on that experience. What aspects of that Canary Wharf exercise did you draw on in order to formulate the plan as you were considering it at this point?
So it's establishing that your priorities are clear, and then establishing how you're going to structure the incident and put a command team in place to carry out the priorities you want to achieve in particular.
What was it about the Canary Wharf exercise that meant that it was similar to or analogous to this incident?
Because I needed to set up a fire sector, which in this case I was also going to be setting up a fire sector. I think on that one I probably set up a search sector, which I decided I wasn't going to do for this incident. I would have set up a lobby sector, which again I planned to for this incident, but I didn't get to do. And then alongside that, I had set up a fire survival guidance coordinator who would coordinate the FSG calls.
Right.
And I think for that incident, that exercise, I put in place an operations commander, so the role I ended up taking for this particular, for Grenfell. So those structures, and then alongside that, because that's, if you like, the operational side of the incident, I then had to do the logistical and command support side of the incident, all the operations that support our firefighting and rescue side. So I would have had to put in that as well, which again, and then alongside that, I'd need someone covering safety. So it's the same roles what I need for that incident as I would need for this incident.
I see. So you talked about structures. So do we take it from that evidence in your statement and what you've told us that actually what you were thinking about then was structures of command?
Structures of command and the authority that goes with that to carry out the objectives that I wish them to carry out.
Right. And just so that I'm clear at that point, the objectives you wish to carry out were what? Can you summarise?
In which area? In the whole incident or just in the fire sector? So the primary role for the fire sector and the fire survival guidance was to coordinate the fire survival guidance calls, identifying them as a priority and setting about the task of rescuing them. And then alongside that to identify those others at risk, such as those on the northeast side of the tower and the people on the upper floors. And then in time it would be the entire building.
And then in the statement, if you continue, you say, alongside this, I also considered the priorities. These were the FSG calls and the people inside the building. I didn't have a specific number on the FSG calls, but I knew the radio had been busy with them, so I assumed that it was big. When you say I assumed that it was big, what do you mean? Could you just clarify that, of course?
Oh, yeah. I think the most I've had in any exercise is, I'm not sure it's ever got into double figures. I think it's been 8 or 10 is the most I've ever had in an exercise. And if each one of those has 2 or 3 people in it, that's a lot of calls and it's an awful lot of people to try and rescue. So that would be regarded as big. Obviously, what occurred on the night was huge, but 8 or 10 would have been a lot to deal with and a lot of people to try and rescue. And I think based on what I was hearing coming in and the exercises I'd previously done and the expectation of how many FSG calls you would have at an incident, that was the sort of number I was anticipating.
Right. And then you say, I'd also considered the fact that some people would be trying to leave the building while others would be staying put, either because they'd been told to do so by control or because they didn't know that the fire existed or were asleep. I'd also estimated that there were between 100 and 200 people to try and get out of the building, and some of these were at greater risk than others. That mirrors something you said earlier in your statement. Just on that last sentence about your estimate of the numbers, people to try to get out of the building, does that mean that at that stage, when you're walking back to the command unit after your handover, at that stage you were actually considering a whole building or partial evacuation?
So I think from probably the moment of arrival, I was thinking the whole building needs to be evacuated or cleared.
Right.
So you consider everybody in a building when you are putting in firefighting and rescue operations. You do think about the other people who may be affected in that building and what you need to do with them. So yes, I was taking into account everyone in the building.
Right. So I'm clear, really from the point of arrival through the briefing to this point, your plan, is this right, was to effect a whole building evacuation?
Yes, it would have been. I don't think for one moment I would have considered a fire that has failed on the outside of the building so catastrophically that we've had to order on an unprecedented number of pumps to, that we would then consider, if we had got it under control, leaving somebody in the building, asleep or something. It just wouldn't have been feasible or a consideration that you would do that. It would always be the intention that you would rescue and evacuate everybody from that building. But you had to do it in some order, and that order was those most at risk.
So that would mean that, is this right, that would mean that nobody would be asked to stay put? You'd have to get everybody out?
They may have to stay put at that point in time because where they are in their flats that are unaffected, you may, if you tell them to leave those flats, they're then leaving into flats that could, or also leaving into a staircase that could be smoke logged. Right. So they may need to stay where they are for a time until we can ensure that we can get them out safely.
Right. Well, I'm just keen to understand this strategy in a bit more detail. How would you go about working out who should be asked to stay put, who should be told to leave if they could without assistance, and who needed assistance?
So at the time, so this is still at the bottom of the tower, what you'd be looking at is the north-east side of the fire, which is where the fire was. So those would be your most at-risk people, because that's where the fire is, and alongside the people on the fire survival guidance calls. Any smoke that's got into the building or from the original fire on the 4th floor is likely to go up to the top floors because the smoke will rise. So they're sort of your next priority. And then you would work your way systematically, making sure that each floor is cleared or searched. And that's how you would base it upon it. Any other information that's coming in through control, you would pass on via your fire survival guidance unit, or pass on, and I would expect them to deal with those other calls.
Right. So I think what you're saying is that you prioritise those for which those callers for whom you had fire survival guidance calls.
Because they're the people you know are at risk, yes.
You'd send crews to those flats?
Yes.
Is that right?
Yes.
And other flats you wouldn't send crews to, or what would you do with the other flats?
So the fire survival guidance calls were the immediate priority because they were the ones who were saying they had either smoke or fire or heat in their flats. So they would have been the priority. If crews along the way are able to check on other flats, then they may well do. But the second priority would be the ones that clearly could become directly affected, which was the north-east side of the building. And then you would have to do a systematic way of searching the other flats, normally from the top downwards.
Right. Now, just focusing on the fire survival guidance calls you did have at that time, do you know how many you had?
So when I got on the unit with Dan Merrick, he was extremely busy. I asked him about FSGs, and he had sheets of paper in front of him.
Right.
I think he apologised because they weren't using the multicoloured papers that we were supposed to use, and he said that they had too many or something, or too much information. So he was using sheets of paper. I can't recall if they were A4 or half pieces of A4, and he had a number of them. If I had to guess on a number, it looked sort of 8 or 10 sheets of paper, but I don't know if they were individual ones or not. He hadn't added them up, and I didn't ask him to add them up.
No.
He was still so busy talking to control, using the fireground radio, and I think even with control, he was using both his telephone and the radio as well.
And did you have any information, or did you go about finding information as to what the conditions were like outside the flats from which fire survival guidance calls were coming?
Not at that point in time, though. So that was the time when I'd just taken over from Richard, and the first person after that I spoke to was Dan.
Yeah.
And that would have taken Dan away from what he was still trying to do, which was get the information from control and get it out to the fireground via the radio, as well as I think sending some of the priority messages for me and getting hold of Mark, and at the same time as trying to do the telephone. So all that was what Dan was trying to do. To then try and get Dan to stop all that and talk me through it just wouldn't have worked, I don't think. What I needed to do was put an officer in place to deal with that directly with Dan, whose only role was to deal with fire survival guidance.
And how would you have got crews to those flats from which fire survival guidance calls were coming safely?
So by putting Richard in charge of the fire sector, with the brief to prioritise the fire survival guidance calls, they'd already have some information that had gone from the original CU to the watch manager dealing with it, that I'd been told about. And then when I put Tom Goodall in charge of fire survival guidance coordination, my expectation was the information from control would go to that command unit, and then from that command unit across to the fire sector. And that would give Richard the knowledge of where those fire survival guidance calls were.
Yeah, but wouldn't you need to know what the conditions were like, the respirable conditions were like in the routes of escape, lobbies and stairs, before you could finalise a plan to send EBA crews up the building, if you had them, or STBAs, if that's all you had, to rescue people and bring them down? Wouldn't you need to have that information?
If the expectation for me was that there would be smoke in the staircase, but the EDBA crews can go up a smoke-filled staircase, so there's no issue with that. If they come across a fire situation, they would then need a firefighting jet to use against it. So you don't need to have an in-depth knowledge of the conditions you are sending them to. So quite often as the incident commander, you've not been into the fire yet in normal circumstances. You don't know what the fire is like inside a building until crews have gone in and checked it for you. So my expectation with Richard would be that Richard would take over the fire sector and establish through the bridgehead what the conditions were that we were expecting and where they could send the DBA crews to.
Well, let's see if we can work from an example or two. And it is, I stress, an example. Can I just ask you to look at the SIL, page 21? And a third of the way down, quarter of the way down the page, at 159.52, so you're on the incident ground, HJF, Heather Fox, creates a service request over the radio to G271, call received, person with 2 children is trapped in her flat number 203 on the 23rd floor. And then that service request is completed by Sharon Darby over the radio. Just taking that as an example, flat 203, 23rd floor, you treat that as a priority. How were you going to satisfy yourself that those callers, or that caller, and the occupants of that flat could be brought safely from the flat, through the lobbies, down the stairs, and out of the building?
So, by setting up the fire survival guidance unit, they would identify that that caller needs to be rescued. They would pass that information onto the fire sector, and they would then deploy BA crews up to that flat to attempt to get those people out. In the event that the conditions in the staircase are completely untenable, if that's where the question is, as in how would they get them through the smoke-filled environment, it is difficult. So normally when you rescue people, you've got to take them through a short travel distance. If it's in a house, it's normally down a flight of stairs. If it's in a flat, it's normally from a room in the flat to the staircase. So it would have been a challenge for them, but if they're already in an environment which is affecting them directly, then the only way is to take them and to get down the stairs as quickly as possible.
Yes. My question really was there any way in which you could or did go about assessing whether those occupants who called could be brought out safely in accordance with your plan?
There could be, well, I'd expect the bridgehead and the fire sector, when they're sending the crews up, they would assess what the conditions are that they're going to bring them down through. If the conditions within their flat are very heavily smoke logged, for example, their only option may be to bring them down a staircase, which could also be smoke logged. So yes, I wanted to know the conditions inside the building, particularly the staircase, but I didn't have that information at that point in time. But you rely upon the crews to make the decision of how they're going to get those people out.
And in order to, and I've asked this question a number of times, and I suppose I'm still curious about it, but in order to formulate a plan, a strategy, a tactic, wouldn't you need information about the conditions in the lobbies and the stairs at, for example, floor 23, in order to be able to work out what strategy you needed, how many people, how many crews you needed to send up, whether it was EDBA, whether they needed water?
Yes, but you don't necessarily have all that information when you set that objective. So if the objective was to rescue those people from that flat, you rely upon the information then coming back from the people you've tasked that to, so the firefighters, to find out the conditions on the way, whether they can get to that flat reasonably, whether there's firefighting needed when they get there, how they're going to evacuate the person. The objective stays the same. The objective is I need you to rescue the people who are within that flat. What you can't do is you rely upon the briefings back to find out whether that's possible or not.
Sorry, you say what you can't do is you rely upon the briefings back?
Yes.
Do you mean you can't rely on the briefings, or
you would rely upon the briefings? You
would rely on the briefings.
Yes, sorry.
So that takes me to the question: did you take any steps when formulating this plan, when you first arrived back at CU8, to find out from the bridgehead what the reports, the debriefs were that were coming from crews that had been in the building? No,
that was a time when the radios were still overwhelmed. So the way I was to get that information was to send Richard to take over the fire sector, and then what I would expect from Richard is him to give me a briefing as soon as he's able to on what the conditions are within the building, how it's operating within the building, and what they're able to achieve.
Now, the strategy that you've described just now, and indeed before the lunch break, about sending VA wearers up to the top and to rescue people on a downwards approach, did you carry that into effect at any point?
And on the whole scale, no. So by the time I went out as operations commander, the fire had got significantly worse, both on the outside of the building, and then when I first went into the tower, it then became clear that the fire wasn't just in individual flats, it was in communal areas as well. Right. So the original plan would have to be changed.
Right. So would this be fair or unfair, that really at the point you were considering your strategy, you had an information vacuum as to details in relation to the FSGs, conditions in the building, and the safety of the means of escape, as far as the occupants were concerned?
Yeah, so I knew that the FSG calls were being dealt with by an officer. I knew a limited amount about the information about the conditions in the building outside of the 4th floor. And then with regard to, sorry, the last point was it the FSG calls? The FSG calls, I knew we had a number of FSG calls that have been going to a pump and then subsequently to a command unit. So I knew that those things were being dealt with, but I had a limited amount of information on them because I hadn't yet had the chance to get all the detail on them.
Did any part of your strategy involve being able to communicate with occupants of the building directly from the fire ground?
No, there's no means to communicate directly with the occupants of the flats. There's no fire alarm system within the building. There's no tannoy system within the building. During the incident, some firefighters were given phones of members of the public who were speaking to people in the building. But in a building like this, there's no means of directly talking to any of the occupants from the outside.
Did you not? Well, let me put it differently. Did you seek to find out whether there was a flat intercom system so that anybody who arrived at the foot of the tower and wanted to be let into a flat pressed a buzzer?
That would not normally be the way we would communicate with people inside the building. It's something that you could consider. It would probably depend on the type of intercom system it is. So some of them are a bit like a telephone. When you press them, they'll ring one flat and one flat only, and that's the only person you can talk to. Others are a bit like an open mic, so everyone can hear. It's not a system I'd ever thought of before. I'm not saying it's not a system that couldn't be used, but I'm not sure it is set up either for Grenfell or other buildings that's the means you would use to talk to it. It's not something that was mentioned. And later on, I suppose, when the fire affected the south side of the building, it would have meant we couldn't get to the intercom system anyway.
Now, you boarded the CU, and that's CU8 on Beaumont Road, I think.
It was, yes.
Yeah. And you say that on boarding the CU, you had two surprises. And this is the foot of page 12. And the first surprise, you say, was that there was no information written up at all. The whiteboards were blank. You see that? Now, you're an hour or so, hour and 20 minutes perhaps into the incident by now. What would you have expected to be written up on the whiteboards in the CU?
So as you go in, the whiteboard to your right normally has something called the headline board, which is a sort of organisational chart is probably the best way to describe it.
Yes.
And if the CSS isn't working, then which is the command support system, the computerised system, if that's not working, then you expect the headline board to be filled out with the organisational chart. So in other words, which officers are doing which roles.
Right. Was the CSS working?
It wasn't turned on, no.
It wasn't turned on. Do you know why not?
No.
Okay. You say if it's not working. That sounds as if that might be a common occurrence.
Later on, I was told it wasn't working. It works the majority of times. It does have faults. I believe the technology is quite. It needs a lot of repair, but it works at most incidents.
Would it have helped on the night? Would it have helped you on the night during the period you were IC to have a working CSS?
It may well have done. Yes, it's difficult to know now.
Okay. Did the fact that the information wasn't written on the boards affect your ability to carry out your role at that stage?
It would have been much more helpful. So that's the organisational chart board. The other one would be the main board in front of you as you get on. Is normally just a blank white board. And within that one you'd expect normally a list of priorities, a list of hazards. Quite often there would be a plan drawing or a schematic of the building to show you what you're dealing with. And then on this particular one I would have expected something like a list of FSG calls or information about that. And instead of any of that, it was just blank. So there was no information to support.
Did you ask the officer on board the CU8 why there was no FSG information on the whiteboards?
So the two officers on board were Richard and Dan. I didn't ask Richard, and it wasn't the time to ask Dan. It was clear why Dan wasn't able to do it. He just had so much to deal with on the radios and the telephones.
Right.
So it would appear that with the two command unit staff, Mark being out on the fire ground and Dan being on the radios, they just had not had the opportunity to put that information up because it normally would be a role that they would do.
Right. Now, at this point, from what you could see, was CU8 still handling FSG?
Yes, so Dan was taking phone calls. Well, I think he was on the main scheme radio and taking phone calls. I think the impression I got was that they were FSGs as well. And he was also trying to operate the Farragut radio as well.
Right. And did you see, was Dan Merrick communicating what he'd learned from control about FSGs to somebody on the incident ground?
He was continuously talking he was talking continuously either on his fireground radio to people or on the main scheme radio or on the telephone.
Right.
So he was doing a 3 or 4 way conversation, I guess, there. So yes, it certainly appeared like he was talking on the radio and he would have been on the command channel, which is to the other command unit operatives on the ground, so most likely would be Mark or any other command unit staff that were there.
Did you see him writing any FSG information down on pieces of paper?
He was definitely writing information down on bits of paper. I think it probably was OSG, but I can't recall. I wasn't looking at what he was writing down specifically.
Did you see any runners?
Sorry. Pardon?
Do you want to finish that answer? Sorry.
I think I could only talk to Dan probably 2 or 3 times during the first 30 minutes, each time for around 30 seconds, so I didn't get the time to look specifically at what he was writing down.
Right. Did you observe any runners coming to the command unit to collect bits of paper and take them into the
So
incident
at that
ground?
point in time, when Dan was on the unit and Richard was on the unit, there were no runners. They were the only 2 officers who came to the unit until, I think the next one to arrive was Tom, if I recall correctly.
Yes, I see. Thank you. Mr. Chairman, Mr. O'Loughlin, it may be appropriate to take a break now.
Would you like that?
Yes.
Right, we'll have a break now then. Well, again, please don't talk to anyone while you're out of the room about your evidence or anything else. And we'll have a break and resume at 5 to 3, if that's right.
Thank you.
Right, thank you very much. Right, 5 to 3 then, please.
Yes, Mr. Chairman, we can continue.
Right, Mr. O'Loughlin?
Yes, thank you, sir.
Happy to carry on?
Yes, sir.
Good, thank you.
Right. Mr. O'Loughlin, thank you for coming back. Can I just take you to the middle of page 12 of your statement, where you refer to the heli-telly? And in the middle of the page, you explain that on the command unit there is a range of communications, comms, and so can communicate with our control, with the fireground, with police control if necessary. They can access the heli-telly from the police helicopters. To your knowledge, was the heli-telly downlink into the command unit working on the night?
I never saw any heli-telly on the command units, so
Right.
I expect not, but I didn't, because I didn't see it. Let's not say it wasn't, sorry. I didn't see the heli-telly downlink working on the command units.
When did you first become aware that the police helicopters were in attendance?
It was either when I was outside the building with Dan and Andy, or
With Dan and Andy, or
Sorry.
Mike and Andy?
Mike and Andy, sorry.
Right.
It's either at that point or when I spoke to the police officer when I was in charge on the unit, or possibly when I went back. So it was sometime in that period. I think it was when Andy and Mike were handing over, but I can't recall it.
Right.
And in fact, I'm only thinking of it through the noise it would have made, but actually thinking about it now, at the bottom of the tower, I probably wouldn't have been able to hear it above the noise of the fire and the debris falling. So I'm not sure I did know it at that point for definite, but I think there was a conversation with the police officer about the heli-telly.
Right.
But I can't recall exactly which one.
When you did discover that police helicopters were in attendance, did you take any steps to see if the heli-telly downlink in the command unit could be made to work?
That would be a conversation I would have with the police to see if it was working, and then with the command unit operatives.
Did you have that conversation?
I can't recall that I did, but it's so normal for us to do it. In fact, they normally do it proactively. You wouldn't normally have to ask them. They normally know themselves when the heli-telly is there
Right.
and they get it to work. So I remember conversations on the night around the heli-telly, but I don't recall specifically if I asked Dan Merrick on the unit. I wouldn't have asked Dan to do it, actually, because he was too busy. If I asked one of the other command unit operatives to do it, or if they told me it wasn't working, I can't recall.
You can't recall. Would it have helped you as incident commander to have had access to the heli-telly and images from the helicopter?
Yes, it most likely would have done, because it would have shown me if there's any other fire spread around the building, or it would have shown me what the fire was doing on that north-east side at a higher level, because obviously I can only see it from a very acute angle at the ground level.
Right. So was that another gap in your information?
It always takes time for the heli-telly to get to work at any fire, so I was aware that the helicopter was there or was ordered there, and the one thing you want is it to be available on the command unit.
Yeah.
So it would have been useful, yes.
Yeah. Sorry, when I say another gap, it was a tendentious question.
Mm-hmm.
But in addition to not knowing detailed information about the conditions in the building, inside, and without knowing detail about the FSG calls, that's why I said another gap.
It's not unusual at the developing stage of a fire, which this still is now because it's getting worse,
Yes.
to not have all the information about all of the incident easily and readily available to you.
Right.
And so you try and gather in as much of that as you can, and the police information from the helicopter will be one source of information that you're relying upon, as well as all the other sources of information that you're trying to collect together.
Now, you said a minute ago, or seconds ago, it's getting worse. I just want to understand that a little bit better. When you got onto the command unit and you were talking to Dan Merrick, and you saw Richard Welch there, did you think that the fire was getting worse?
The likelihood was that even if the fire on the outside of the building did burn off, which I hoped it would, but obviously it didn't, we know now, the fires within the flats, or the smoke from the flats, is likely to they will get worse until we put the fires out, if we were able to.
Right.
So I had no knowledge that they were getting worse. The expectation was that until we are able to put those fires out, they're not going to get better on their own, as it were. They're not going to go out on their own.
So at that moment, would it be right to say that you were aware that this was a very dynamic situation, dynamic
It
fire?
was extremely dynamic. I've never ordered 40 fire engines to a fire before, so it's about the most dynamic I think that most officers there had ever been to a fire.
And by dynamic, do you mean liable to change and get worse or behave unpredictably?
It would have the potential to do. I mean, it's already acted very unpredictably insofar as it's gone up the outside of the building like it has, and there's the number of fire survival guidance calls, so it's already done that. The thing that you're trying to do is put some sort of measure on, based on your experience and your knowledge of what you think it may do next, And at that point in time, it was still that it would create fires on the north-east side of the building in individual flats.
Right. Would you describe the fire as unpredictable at that point?
It had been unpredictable before I got there, insofar as it had gone up the outside of the building in the manner it did,
Yeah.
which is not something I'd ever experienced or seen or been aware of before in this country.
No, but, sorry, I'll ask the question again. It had done that, we know. But at that moment, did you think the fire was unpredictable?
It's reasonable to say, yes, the fire was unpredictable at that point in
Well,
time.
it's reasonable, I'm sorry. Did you think it was at the time?
Yes.
You did. Given that the fire, as you thought, was unpredictable at the time, did you, at that point, we're now on CU8, consider whether now was the time to at least rethink the stay put advice being given to residents who at that moment weren't, let's say, affected by the fire, smoke or heat?
The issue with telling the people who are unaffected by the fire to leave is that I did not know the conditions in the staircase at that point in time. So I'd be asking people to leave unaffected flats that may never become affected into a potentially smoke-filled staircase. So until I had a good knowledge, or the fire sector command had a good knowledge of what the staircase was doing, I wouldn't have wanted 10 people to leave and the risk that they would get trapped on a staircase full of smoke. Right. In addition to that, you've also got our firefighters trying to go in, and they're obviously carrying quite a lot of equipment and quite bulky with that equipment. So you'd have a flow of people trying to rush out if it was even possible to let those people know, at the same time as you're trying to get people in, which are firefighters, to the people most at risk, which was the ones involved in the fire survival guidance course. Mm. And the staircases don't allow very easily for a sort of two-way flow of traffic, as it were.
Yeah. My question is really aimed at really trying to find out how reliable it was that people who were for the time being safe in their flats would stay safe given the dynamic nature of the fire.
Depending on where their flats were, so the expectation that the fire wouldn't go horizontally around the building in the way that it did, because there was no reason to believe that was going to happen. It would appear that the outside fire was on the north-east side of the building, and then the internal fires were what we needed to address. And if none of those had breached into the lobbies and the staircases, then the people in unaffected flats had the potential of not being affected at all. So my thinking would be, as an example, if there's people on the southwest side of that building, there's no reason to consider that the fire would go externally around to their flats, or that it would come out of a northeast flat across a lobby and then into a flat internally. There was no reason to think at any point in those early stages that that was a likelihood.
When did you first think that, or first hear that the fire was, quotes, wrapping round the building, unquotes, your words and your contemporaneous know?
I can't recall if that was mentioned by Andy and Mike. I don't think it was. If it was, my interpretation of that was that it was that wind that I described earlier on the northeast corner, if you like. And that could be a normal thinking of it. The wind will blow it slightly around to one side of the building. That was probably after I'd gone out and seen the building, initially on the south side that I saw, and then obviously the east-west side as well. And wrapping became a common term people were using because it was going horizontally around. That's the way people were describing it. It was wrapping around the building. And a number of firefighters and officers.
At what point was that? At what point in time?
I'd say it was probably when I went out as operations commander.
Right.
And onwards from there.
Now, going back to your statement, you say you had two surprises, page 12, and you say the second surprise, and this is the very foot of page 12, Mr. O'Loughlin, was that Group Manager Richard Welch was on the unit and that he was wearing the Incident Commander tabard. Now, just explore that a bit. Group Manager Welch recalls that you arrived on the command unit and told him that you were Incident Commander at about 2:11. And it was you who asked for the message at 2:11:46 to make FRU 6. Do you remember that?
I remember meeting Richard and telling him I was Incident Commander, yes.
Okay. And I think you then got a message to the control room to say that you were Incident Commander.
I would have asked for that to be done, yes.
Yeah, we have that we don't need to go to it, we have that at 2:11:48, and it's page 70 of the control report. It doesn't look as if the senior officers were told individually who the Incident Commander was.
The only senior officer that I'd spoken to was Andy Walton. And so Andy Walton knew that I was Incident Commander, and then when I got onto the command unit, Richard Welsh knew I was Incident Commander. They were the only two senior officers that I had any direct communication with at that point. And then the message should have gone out from Mark Kempfield to the incident ground that I'd taken over the incident, and then everybody understood. But I think, to be fair on that one, the radios were so congested it wouldn't surprise me if that message wasn't possible. But the two senior officers at that point that I knew about was Andy Walton and Richard, and they both knew I was the incident commander.
Did you get told or get the impression that at some point Station Manager Loft had been incident commander?
Incident commander, no.
Now, looking at your statement on page 13, you start by saying at the very top of the page that Richard Welch apologised by saying that he hadn't realised that you were present at the incident. You then say, I informed him that I was, and that I was in charge. He then told me he'd made pumps 40 and implemented the major incident procedure. He'd explained this is all he'd done, as he'd only just arrived on the CU himself. I said that I was happy with his actions and thanked him. Did he tell you that he had instructed Station Manager West to send a methane message?
No, he didn't know. The first contact or awareness I had of Steve West was much later on when I was in charge, and I asked him to take over Sector Command support. Until that point, I didn't know Steve West was on the incident ground.
Did Group Manager Welch tell you that he'd asked anybody to send a methane message?
I think somebody was drafting a methane message. It was on the whiteboard as you go into the unit on the left-hand side. Somebody had written methane up and had started to populate it.
Do you know who that was?
I don't know who that was.
You don't know who that was. So far as the major incident procedure is concerned, did you know that the police themselves declared a major incident at just after 1:30 a.m?
I didn't know that, no.
Right. Did you, or did he, Richard Welch, tell the local authority that a major incident had been declared?
Richard wouldn't do that. The major incident procedure message should notify the local authority as one of the responders. They have to be told. So by sending a major incident message, he's sending an alert, if you like, to a number of Category 1 and Category 2 responders.
Right.
So that would be done by Control. Obviously, Control was extremely busy at that point in time, but that's the point of the message, is to alert those who may need to know to help us.
And to your way of understanding, that would include the local authority, would it?
Almost certainly. I think they are the Category 1 responders, possibly Category 2, I can't recall.
Okay. Do you remember a Watch Manager Harrison being on the command unit?
Not at that point in time, no. So the only two on the unit at that point in time was Richard and Dan Merrick.
Right. Now, on page 13 of your statement, you say, or you describe how you asked Richard Welch to take command of the fire sector from Andy Walton. That's a third of the way down. And then you go on to say, I then explained what I'd just seen, in that the fire was affecting most of the floors from the 3rd to 4th floors and up to the roof level, and seemed to be on the outside of the building at that time. I informed him that FSG was in progress, but had no numbers and no idea of priority. I told him to focus on rescue and firefighting inside the entire building, and that the entire inside of the building was essentially now the fire sector. Now, when you say there, and seemed to be on the outside of the building at that time, did you tell him that, or did you tell him a little bit more, which is that it was
I think
affecting
with all the officers, one
flats?
of the first things I asked is if they'd seen the fire, and Richard said he had seen the fire. And then I told him what my understanding of what I'd seen was, to see if it was the same as what he had seen. So I'd seen a fire on the northeast side of the building going from around the 3rd or 4th floor up to the top of the building, and whether that was what he'd seen as well, and it was. And then we got onto the FSGs as the next thing. And within the FSG conversation, that's where I would have been saying that it looks like the fire is in the flats, or at least the smoke is in the flats, although it's not in the statement. If there's an FSG in progress, then it means that there is smoke or fire in their flats.
Right, just to be clear, at any point during your conversation with Richard Welch, did you tell him that, so far as you could see, or as far as you understood, fire had penetrated into flats?
I couldn't see if the fire had got into the flats. So from the angle I'd seen it at, I could only see the fire on the outside of the building.
Yeah.
But with the messages that were coming in through the FSG that I'd heard en route, it appeared that the fire was getting from the outside of the building into some of those flats.
Yes.
So
did you tell Richard Welch that?
We had the conversation about that, so yes.
You did. Okay. Now, you say you had no numbers or priorities for FSG messages. Were you able to ask the operator on the CU, Dan Merrick, about those FSG messages?
Not at that point in time. So this was... So I was aware, so that's when Dan was extremely busy, so I was aware that he was doing those. So when I say I have no idea of numbers and priorities, I know we've got a lot of them, and I know that they are a priority themselves, but I can't break them down for Richard at that point in time. So what I wanted from Richard, and I knew there was a system already set up where that information was going to the officer at the tower that Mike and Dan had told me about. Mike and Andy had told me about. So I knew there was a system in place, but what I didn't have at that point to give Richard was an exact number of how many FSGs we had and what the priority of them was. But there was a system. And then most likely I would have told Richard that I'll put in a fire survival guidance unit to help that along.
I see. Now, in that last answer, you said that Mike and Andy told you about a system whereby FSG information was going to the officer at the tower. Was that during the briefing?
That was during the briefing when they told me they had an officer dealing with the FSGs.
Right.
And my recollection was that was possibly with Golf 271.
Right. Did they give you any more detail about what that system of communication was?
No, they didn't.
Did they tell you what the officer was?
No, that's it. So that's where I'm certain they didn't say it was a station manager because of the fact that
right.
I thought I only had one station manager at that point in time. So when they said an officer, and my expectation was it was a watch manager. And in fact, more so that was because if it had been another officer, then I would have expected that a station manager. I would have expected that station manager to be with Andy Walton because Andy had only taken over 5 minutes before.
Right.
So if there'd been additional station managers there, I would have expected them to be there with Andy Walton because he had only just taken over.
Okay. At this point, did you know about a plan or emerging plan to have a watch manager collating fire survival guidance details outside the tower and then running those messages into the tower?
I wouldn't say I knew that plan as detailed, but that's what I would have been expected to happen, is that the officer that's been assigned to coordinate the fire survival guidance calls at that point is writing them all down, if you like, and then taking them into the tower to the bridgehead, or getting somebody to take them into the tower to the bridgehead so the bridgehead can then act upon them. Again, as I said, the radios were overwhelmed, so we couldn't use they wouldn't have been able to use the radios.
Right. Now, you say in your statement that you had no numbers and no idea of priority. Did you then go about seeing how you could get numbers and an idea of priority?
So I knew that Dan had the detail of those, and what I wanted to do was set up a fire survival guidance coordinator to deal with the detail of that, and use Dan to support that setting up. And so when I say I had no idea of numbers, as in I couldn't have told Richard the exact number of FSG calls at that point, unless I asked Dan to start counting them up for me, but Dan was already too busy with the communication systems he was working on.
How was Richard Welch going to get those numbers so that a prioritisation system could be put in place?
So Richard's task initially was to take over the fire sector to establish what we had going on there, and then as quickly as I could, I would get the FSG unit set up to support him in exactly that, in identifying exactly where these flats were and the priority of them. In the meantime, there was already a system set up, which was, it would appear Dan Merrick to the officer at the base of the tower, and then from the base of the tower to the bridgehead. Yeah. So there was a early system set up. Yeah. I wanted a much more robust system that would last for hours rather than what we had at that point.
Right. But so, given where we got to, and you'd been on the incident ground for some little time, you got back to the CU, you still hadn't had any idea in terms of numbers or priorities for FSGs. Did it occur to you to get hold of somebody in the control room to get that information for yourself so that you could at least brief Richard Welch with that?
No, because that information was coming through to us. It was going to Dan. It was just that we didn't have the opportunity for Dan to add them all up, as it were, and give them over to me. What Dan needed was a team to help him do it.
I understand that.
So if I had a phone control, I wouldn't have been able to manage the entire incident. I would have only been able to get specific details about the fire survival guidance calls. What I wanted was someone else to take on the whole responsibility of the fire survival guidance coordination, and so they could do that for me with a team of people working with them.
Yes, I'm sorry, I'm going to press that a little bit more. I understand that you didn't have and perhaps couldn't manage the exact details, but my question really is why didn't you get hold of somebody at control, perhaps the officer of the watch, and just say, well, give me a general impression of what you've got there, numbers, flats, floors. I don't need the exact details, I just need to understand in general terms so that I can formulate my strategy with greater precision here on the incident ground.
It's not the way you'd normally communicate with control. You'd do it through your comms officer. I think also in that point in time, I'd say within probably 30 seconds of Richard leaving the unit, Tom Goodall turned up. So I had a person who could take that from me. So at that point in time, it would have been, I'd have had to put Tom on hold while I made a phone call to control. So it wouldn't have been the best use at that point of my time to try to get that set up. It was better to assign it to an officer to take command of that as a whole, rather than me trying to get through control, who I knew were overwhelmed already because I'd heard that on the radios.
Okay. Now, at the bottom of page 13, you say, then quite quickly, additional officers arrived. And the next officer who came on board was Group Manager Tom Goodall, who's in charge of our operational policy team, where one of his responsibilities is FSG. And then you say, I explained to him that the key priority at this point was coordinating the FSG calls and establishing how many people we had inside the building, how many of those were talking to control, how many were a priority and at risk, and how many we needed to get to quickly. How did you expect him to go about that task?
Either I came up with or somebody else recommended using the Command Unit 7. I knew Command Unit 7 was, or a Command Unit I should say, was closer to the tower. So he'd need to do that from a Command Unit. So the option was either he kept the Command Unit that I was on, which was further away from the tower, or he went to the Command Unit that was closer to the tower.
Right.
So I gave him, or told him to take the Command Unit closer to the tower, which I now know to be CU7. And also to take Dan Merrick with him as well, or sent Dan Merrick with him, because Dan Merrick was the person who had all of the information at that point in time.
Right. Would you not need to know this information yourself at the earliest possible stage so that you could finalise the formulation of your strategy and resource the incident appropriately?
So resources-wise, we had a huge number of resources en route already. So I was satisfied that the number of resources we had coming were enough for that building. So I don't think you physically could have fitted the number of firefighters that I'd ordered on into the building in probably the next hour or so. So resources-wise, I was satisfied.
Right.
With regard to the detail of the FSGs, it was better if one person could take control of that and then coordinate it through the unit, and that's the way the system is set up to work, if you like. So that person, their entire responsibility and the team they're working with is to focus on the fire survival guidance detail and then identifying that to support the fire sector in carrying out the rescues. Again, as a whole, I've got the entire incident to manage, so there's a lot of other things I need to put in place as the incident commander. So it is, clearly it's important information, but I'm handing over that responsibility to the fire survival guidance coordinator to coordinate on my behalf.
And would you expect them to feed back to you?
Yes, I would expect them to feed back to me.
Okay, we'll come back to that. Now on page 13 of your statement, still on that, you say that you tasked Richard Welch with rescue and firefighting. It's halfway down and you say, I told him to focus on rescue and firefighting inside the entire building. We looked at that a minute ago. I just want to ask you a question or two about that. When you say rescue and firefighting, perhaps I should wait until it gets marked. It's exactly halfway down the page, and it's the sentence that starts, I told him to focus on rescue and firefighting inside the entire building. Yes. Now, how did you envisage at that time, when you were briefing Richard Welch, that these rescues should be carried out?
So he would get the information about a fire survival guidance call from a particular flat. He would send crews to that flat, and if they were able to rescue them without firefighting, then they would rescue them and evacuate them from the building. If, however, when they got to the flat they needed to fight the fire, then they would have to get jets to that floor and attack the fire, and then rescue the person.
And how did you envisage that firefighting would work with a fire that had spread from the third or fourth floor right to the very top and was beginning to move around the northeast face, northeast corner?
So at that point in time, it's still the northeast corner, is my understanding of where the fire is, and it's on the outside of the building. What my expectation was, there is a number of flats that have caught alight, but that the fire, because they're compartmented, should stay within those flats. So my experience has been that a fire within a flat in a high-rise building can stay contained within that flat for an hour or more without it being attacked with firefighting media, and it will still stay within that individual flat. So what you effectively have here is a number of flats on fire individually within the building. There was no reason to think at that point that they were all going to breach into the lobbies and or breach into the staircase or other flats. So you effectively have got a number of high-rise flat fires on different floors that you have to attack each high-rise flat fire individually at that point in time.
But if that's so, does that mean that you were assuming or working on the assumption that although fire had got into flats, the fire was contained in those flats and that therefore the lobbies and stairway were clear.
So the reason normally that you would have the smoke or heat coming out of a flat into a lobby is if the occupants have left the door open when they've left themselves, and then there's nothing to stop it getting out. Alternatively, it would have to burn through the door of the flat. And the doors of the flats are normally quite substantial doors. They should give you a minimum of 30 minutes protection. So you'd need the fire to have got into the flat and then got through to the door of the flat and then burnt through the door of the flat into the lobby. Even when it gets into the lobby, there shouldn't be any fuel in that lobby for the fire to sort of get worse, as it were. So there's no storage in the lobby, for example. So my expectation is that you've got a series of flat fires on the north-east side of the building that if it does get into the lobbies, it will be possibly where people have left their doors open as they've left.
Right.
But it shouldn't be through the fact that it's burning through. You wouldn't expect that number of flat compartments to fail.
But compartmentation, correct me if I'm wrong, but compartmentation fails when fire breaches, but also when smoke breaches.
Again, if a front door of a flat that's fitted correctly, that's working correctly, the smoke or heat shouldn't get out of that flat. So the door should stop the heat or smoke coming out of the flat.
Right. So at this point, when you're briefing Group Manager Welch, what assumptions were you making about whether or not there was smoke spread through the lobbies and stairwell?
So my expectation was that there was a possibility of smoke in the staircase from the original flyer, from the floor flyer, and that with a series of flat fires on the floors on the right hand, on the northeast corner, that there was the possibility that there could be smoke in some of the lobbies, and that smoke may get into the staircase. Again, it shouldn't get into the staircase from the lobbies because the doors to the staircase should close automatically and keep the smoke out.
Yeah.
But there's the possibility of it, and that's something that I need to find out from the fire sector commander.
Right.
But there's no reason to expect it to have done that, because you expect the compartmentation, effectively the doors, to do the job they're designed to do, which is to keep the heat and smoke away from the communal areas.
Right. But, if you were going to act on that expectation, then would that not mean that actually revoking stay put and getting everybody to evacuate would be safe, because on that expectation the exit routes wouldn't be smoke compromised?
Well, they're potentially smoke compromised from the fourth floor fire still.
Right.
And without the knowledge of if they are, I'd still be asking someone to leave a flat that's not affected by smoke and go through a smoke-filled environment to try to escape. And you've also got the issue of how to communicate with them. So again, there was no direct means of communicating with them. There's no tannoy system or fire alarm system. And at the same time, you then have people who were in a safe environment now going into the staircase, which would impede the firefighters who have to go in and try to carry out the rescues of the people which I believe most at risk at that point in time, which was the fire survival guidance school. So again, you'd end up with a two-way traffic almost on the staircase, which would hinder the rescue operation of the people that were most at risk, which was the fire survival guidance schools.
Did you, in your own mind, looking back on it, did you balance the risks of revoking stay put and putting people into air that you would assume on that expectation would be relatively clean, on the one hand, with, on the other hand, the risk that if they stayed in their flats, the fire would develop so dynamically that they would become affected?
But again, I think if you think of the flats on the southwest side, so the opposite side to where the fire was on the northeast side, there was no reason to think at that point that the fire was going to go horizontally around the outside of the building like it did. So that's not something I'd experienced or seen before. So there was no reason to think that it was going to go around the building and then get into those flats. Or similarly, there was no reason to believe it was going to breach a flat door on the northeast side, go across a lobby and then breach a door on the southwest side. So there was a number of people in parts of that building who should have been safe if the building had done as it was designed to do and not as it did on the night, clearly.
At what point during your period as incident commander, sorry, let me try this a different way. Did there come a point during your period in command as incident commander when you thought the building had failed completely, so that nobody was reliably safe?
Not as incident commander, no.
Right. Did that point come later?
It came when I went out as operations commander and I'd seen the fire now spreading to the southwest corner and south side of the building.
Okay. At page 13, still on page 13, can I just ask you to look at the very end of the first main paragraph, just below halfway down. You say, I think we discussed comms and explained that the radios were poor, so advised he put a runner in if needed. This is 2/3 of the way down the page. Do you see that? This is the footer on the 3 lines up from the bottom of the screen. I think we discussed comms and explained that the radios were poor, so advised he put a runner in if needed. This is page 13 of your statement. Poor in what sense?
Too many people speaking on it, so too many people trying to send messages across. So because we were, so this was still outside the building, not inside. So there was no problem with the distance, because it was probably, I'm guessing, maybe 100 to 150 metres. It was more that there were so many people talking, and there was only one radio channel at that point.
Did that affect communications between crews inside the building, did you think?
Inside the building, not with BA crews, they're on a different radio channel, so that may have happened separately.
Right.
But it could have affected the bridgehead commander, because he would have been on the command channel as well. So it's possible that well, it would have been actually, that they can't communicate either, because everybody's trying to talk at the same time on the radio.
Right. What about communication of FSGs from the command unit onto the incident ground?
So the FSGs, if they're going from down Merrick, are done on the command channel, and only the command unit officers use that channel. So he should have been able to speak to the other command unit officers, in particular Mark Kempfield, with that information.
Right.
And that channel wouldn't have been overwhelmed, because there was only, at that point, maybe 2 or 4 command unit staff.
Right. Was that Channel 6?
No, Channel 6 was the BA channel. Channel 10.
Channel 10, right. And now, after Group Manager Welch left the command unit, and indeed during the rest of the incident, did you ever receive any information back from him or from anybody else about the progress that firefighters were making to respond to FSG calls?
I went inside the building as operations commander a lot of times to speak to both Richard and Pat about the progress we were making.
Okay.
And received a lot of information about the rescues they were carrying out.
Right. We'll come to that. But just in general terms at this stage, was the information that you got from them written down anywhere, or was it just face-to-face?
As operations commander, it was all face-to-face.
Right. Now, during your time as incident commander, did you stay on the command unit? I think you said you went to the tower. How many times did you go to the tower?
No, sorry, as incident commander, no. The only time as incident commander I went to the tower was when I took over from Andy and Mike. And then when I went to the command unit, I handed over to Andy Rowe, and I hadn't left the command unit during that time.
Right.
Except to step off to speak to the police and ambulance, which was right by the door of the command unit.
Okay.
And then, as operations commander, was the second time I went back to the tower.
Now, you were on, I think you were in command for a period of about 25, maybe 30 minutes. Is that right?
Yes, possibly. I think if you count, I think on the incident logs it's probably from 10 or 11 minutes past 2,
yeah.
But of course I was underneath the tower with Andy Walton at probably around 2 o'clock, so there may be another 10 minutes
right.
at the beginning where the incident log isn't logged.
Now, during your period on the command unit, other officers, I think, joined you. And if we look at your contemporaneous notes, page 3, we can see, I think, who came on. If we go to the top of page 3, Pat Goulbourne, did he come onto the command unit?
Yep, so I had a steady stream of officers. I think the first one I recall coming on was Tom Goodall.
Yes, and
then I thought it was Pat Goulbourne, followed by Dave O'Neill, followed by Steve West. That's as the group managers. There were a number of watch managers and station managers during that time.
Right.
But they were the 4 group managers, I recall.
Okay.
Sorry, alongside the ORT officers because one of those is a group manager of Matt Cook, and Mick Mulholland as a station manager at the time.
Right. I'm just going to pick up on 1 or 2 of those briefings in detail if I can. Starting with Group Manager Tom Goodall, who, in the second bullet point, you can see there, you tasked to take over the Fire Survival Guidance Coordinator, or as coordinator, and use the CU7 on Grenfell Road. You say he was to set up the unit for the FSGs coming in and to coordinate with the fire sector. Do you remember ever seeing Daniel Egan, Station Manager Daniel Egan, at the command unit?
I don't know Dan Egan apart from through this inquiry. He could have been one of the station managers or watch managers that came
right.
to the unit during the time the group managers and station managers were all appearing. But
all right.
I don't know him. I didn't brief a station manager to take on a role. It was the group managers I was briefing.
Let me see if you can cut the knot for us. I ask you that question because Tom Goodall has told us that he thought you asked Dan Egan to do FSGs, but Dan Egan says it was Richard Welch, but Richard Welch says he didn't remember seeing Dan Egan. So we've got a set of recollections that are different. What's your recollection?
I briefed Tom Goodall to do the fire survival guidance.
Right.
I wouldn't have briefed Dan Egan. I don't know Dan Egan.
Okay. And did you brief Tom Goodall in the presence of Richard Welch?
No, Richard had already left. He'd already
Right.
gone to the tower.
Okay. Now, at the moment when you briefed Tom Goodall to act as FSG coordinator, had you discovered by that point who had been coordinating FSGs up to that point?
No, at that point it was still just that I'd heard at the beginning that it was an officer was doing them at the bottom of the tower.
Right.
And obviously Dan Merrick on the unit.
Okay. Did Group Manager Welch tell you anything about Station Manager Brett Loft's involvement in coordinating FSGs?
I don't remember any conversations about Brett Loft on the night at all.
Right. If you didn't know who had been coordinating FSGs up to the point when you instructed Group Manager Goodall, did you ask Group Manager Goodall to find out who it was and
Yeah,
take a handover from them?
I think I said there's an officer out on the fire ground who's dealing with them.
Right.
And find that person.
Okay. And you would have expected, I imagine, to get him to get a full handover.
I'd expect to get a handover, but also to keep that person with them. So that person would then go on to the unit with Tom and work with Tom alongside Dan Merrick as well, and
Right.
others that I sent across.
So is this right? So as far as you're concerned, you brief Tom Goodall to act as FSG coordinator and you leave it to him to find out who he's taking over from?
Yes.
And how would he have found that out? Do you know?
So the physical dimension, physical area of the building wasn't that big. So where that officer was, somewhere on the outside of the tower, either I think working on a pump was what I've been told. I'd expect Tom to go out and either find the person himself or find someone to find him for them.
Right. Was there a special tabard that the FSG coordinator would have worn to identify him easily?
There wouldn't have been up until that point, so we do have an FSG coordinator tabard, and I would expect Tom would have put one of those on. I doubt with the way the incident was going at those early stages, they'd have got time to put a tabard on. So he would have had to send someone to go and find them or go and find them himself. But it wasn't a physically big area that they've had to look on. So it was on that southeast side that Mike had sort of pointed towards somewhere in that area. So
Right.
it wouldn't have shouldn't have been that difficult to find them. But no, I didn't tell him where they were, so I didn't know at the time.
Okay. So in your last answer, I'm not quite sure I understood it. You say wouldn't have been up to that point. We do have an FSG coordinator tabard. Did the LFB have FSG coordinated tabards on vehicles
So we have
on the night?
a huge range of tabards that you then put inserts into, which have the name of the role you're doing. So if, for example, you were doing water, it would say water.
Right.
So the tabards all look the same. They're all set to commander tabards, and they'd have a different insert.
Right.
So there's a lot of inserts. I expect one of them is almost certainly a fire survival guidance coordinator.
Did you give Group Manager Goodall any kind of positive information about FSGs?
So I said we'd heard a number of SSGs en route, that Dan Merrick had information on them, that he needed to contact control and find out, or get communications set up with control and find out how many we were dealing with, what the priorities were and where they were.
Right. Did you tell him to go to CU7?
Yes, CU7 was the one we set up.
Why did you tell him to do that rather than just staying on CU8 and yourself moving to CU7? To
So
set that one up?
CU7 was closer to the tower, so if they weren't able to use radios and they had to put runners in, it was a shorter distance to travel. And there was nothing physically on CU8 other than Dan Merrick and his bits of paper that made that unit essential. So if, for example, there'd been a huge list of FSG calls written up on the boards, then I may not have taken that same decision. But there was nothing physically on CU8 that was useful to them other than Dan and the information he had. And
Right.
CU7 was just much closer.
Right. Would that not have risked taking time, losing valuable time between CU8, doing the move between CU8 and CU7?
It was such a short distance, it's probably less than a minute maybe.
Right.
And for the benefit of the closeness to the tower, it was, in my view, worth having it that much closer to the tower so that they've got a shorter travel distance to get the information into the building.
So you weren't concerned about any delay?
It was such a short amount of time, so it was... So in fact, Dan would have gone across with his mobile phone, so he's actually still speaking with control. So he may, for about 30 seconds to a minute, not have the main scheme radio available to him, but he would have still had his phone to control, because it's a mobile phone on the unit, so they can travel around with it. So it was more important that they got closer to the tower.
Right. Did you tell Group Manager Goodall about the difficulties with communicating by radio?
Yes, I almost certainly would have done. I mean, and it was actually obvious because the radios were just still so busy. I think I'd turned, so when you go onto the command units, you're supposed to turn your radios off because they can interfere with the communication system. I don't think I turned mine off, I turned it down, and you could still hear there was a huge amount of traffic going across them. So it would have been, I think I would have said it, but it would have been obvious as well.
Right. And then turning to top of page 14 and looking at a little bit more of the briefing you gave to Tom Goodall, it's the top part of that page, and you say to him, I made it clear to him that some people would still be asleep and unaware of the fire. Some would be talking to control and being told to leave or stay put, depending on what information individuals were supplying. As I understood it at that time, the stay put advice was still in place for the whole building. The fire was still external, but might, if we were lucky, spread to 1 or 2 flats who had their windows open, or if the fire burned for long enough to breach the windows. Should fire penetrate the building, it shouldn't then move from flat to flat. Tom understood the roller coordinator, and then he left. Did you say to him, if we're unlucky, that the fire will spread to 1 or 2 flats
Sorry, say that again.
who had their windows open? Or was that just an assumption in your own head you were making?
No, I think it's probably that it has spread to, and it would have been more than 1 and 2.
Right.
I probably would have said it spread to some of the flats, but based on the calls. And then in my head, the reason it had got into those flats is from the windows. So,
Right.
So I may have said it, but my expectation from the fire survival guidance calls, it would have been in more than 1 or 2 flats
As
at
you
that
said.
point.
Right.
And most likely through the windows that would have been open.
Okay. Did you have a conversation, in the light of that instruction, with Tom Goodall about the wisdom of keeping the stay put advice in place for the whole building?
No, we didn't. No, I think our focus was on fire survival guidance calls. So if somebody is making a call to control and is able to escape, then you would expect them to escape. And once you get into fire survival guidance, they are saying, "I can't escape from my flat." And it was our primary focus was on fire survival guidance calls at that point.
Yeah. At that point in the night, and I know we moved on perhaps not very far in terms of timing, but did you have another thought or a thought about whether to revoke the stay put advice at least for part of the building?
Well, again, I'd be revoking it for the people who are in unaffected parts of the building. So not only would I be risking exposing them to any potential smoke in the staircase from the original fire, they'd also then be hindering the firefighters getting into the building to get to the floors where the fire survival guidance calls are coming. So at that point, the primary focus was still to get firefighters to the fire survival guidance calls and to the top floors where the smoke may end up smoke logging at the upper floors. So that was always the primary focus of it.
Yeah.
And along with that, there was no way I could communicate with people who, in the way I've read it at the time, there will probably be people still asleep. There's no way I've got to communicate directly with those people.
Yes. Yes, thank you. This may be an appropriate moment for a break, Mr. Chairman.
Yes, my very thought, Mr.
I thought so.
We'll have a short break now again, Mr. O'Loughlin. Again, don't talk to anyone, please, about your evidence when you're out of the room. And we'll resume at 10 to 4. I assume, Mr. Millett, that you are expecting to run through till 4:30 today.
Yes, I am. And I should be clear with you and the witness that I am not confident of finishing today. I hope that doesn't come as too much of a shock to you, Mr. O'Loughlin. I'm afraid I was hoping to be able to do that, but I may well not.
See where you are.
I'll see where I am.
I'm going to assume that you're going to want to continue with the witness until 4:30, in which case 10 minutes now I think is essential.
Absolutely.
Right, so
Thank you.
10 to 4 then, please.
Thank you.
Thanks so much. Right, 10 to 4 then, please. Right, ready to go on, Mr. McLaughlin?
Yes, sir, thank you.
Mr. O'Loughlin, sorry. Yes.
Mr. O'Loughlin, thank you for coming back, and I'm sorry to keep detaining you. Can I ask you, please, to go to page 15 of your statement, where at the top of the page, in the first main paragraph break, you say the next officer to appear on the CU was Group Manager Pat Goulbourne. And you then proceed to describe his briefing, and you say halfway down the page, just before the paragraph break, I would also have briefed him about the FSG calls and that Tom Goodall was coordinating that aspect. Did you in fact brief Group Manager Goulbourne about the FSG calls?
So normally when you assign officers to sectors, you'd brief them on what other sectors you've got in place, just so they have a general understanding of who's doing what. You wouldn't necessarily then run through, again, the briefing you'd just given to Tom.
No.
But I would have said to him that Richard had the fire sector and that Tom Goodall had the FSG sector.
Right. So you suggested the role of operations commander, but basically you made him and Richard Welch joint fire and search.
Yeah, Richard Welch was the fire sector commander. Pat was going across to assist him.
Yeah.
And I expected them to work as a team carrying out that role.
Exactly. And did you actually brief him to do that?
Yes, to assist Richard within the fire sector.
Right. And did you expect him or ask him to find out as much as he could about the current status of fire survival guidance calls, where they were coming from, and what resources were needed to attack the fire as well?
Sorry, could you just repeat, because at the beginning of that question I couldn't quite hear.
Did you... let me try it a different way. Did you brief him to find out as much as he could about the current status of fire survival guidance calls?
I expect I probably didn't know, because I'd asked Richard to do that as the fire sector and then Tom to do that as the fire survival guidance coordinator. What I wanted from Pat was him to go to Richard and get a briefing from Richard about what Richard needed at that point in time. So I'm sure I would have mentioned the fire survival guidance calls, but I wouldn't have given Pat specific objectives or tasks. He was to work with Richard to achieve what I'd given Richard.
I see. So the briefing didn't contain any specifics. It was just essentially go and help Richard Welch.
With a little bit more than that, but yeah, effectively yes. Go and assist Richard. He's got a lot to do.
Okay. Now you then say at the bottom of page 15 that the next officer to arrive was Group Manager Dave O'Neill, and you gave him the role of safety sector, and you explain why. You said you were concerned that debris falling from the building was a real danger, because it was falling out and planing out to a distance of 50 to 75 metres, and so posing a real risk. And then you say, this made me think about whether or not there was a danger to the structure itself. At this stage, I didn't think that there was a risk of collapse, but concerned that depending on how the cladding was bolted on, that it might also bring down chunks of the building as well. Now, we know that around 2/17/36, a dangerous structure engineer was requested, and that's page 22 of the short incident log. I can show you if you want, but do you remember a dangerous structure engineer being requested at about that time?
Yes.
You do. Was it you who requested the DSE?
Yes.
Were you concerned, having explained what you've explained at the foot of page 15, that there was at least a risk of partial structural failure?
So by partial failure, what I was thinking of was depending on how the bolts are attached to the building. So the chunks I'd seen falling down, some of them were huge, at least sort of 3 feet, possibly up to 6 feet in size. I didn't know the weight of those at all. So how they'd been attached to the building wasn't something I would have known. So if they're attached with 6 or 8 or 12-inch bolts, if a number of those are starting to pull chunks of concrete from the building when they fall, for example, I needed to know what the likelihood of that would be on particularly that northeast corner where it may be weakening, if you like, the northeast column. Again, when you talk about collapse, I was thinking more if there was huge chunks coming out, not so much a collapse of the northeast side. It was more just if bits of the actual building were falling down, not just the cladding.
Yes. Yes. Just following that up a little bit, can I ask you please to go to the PRC notes, which we've looked at before, which is tab 24 of the documents bundle. That's 3112, LFB 3112. And go please to page 20. Page 20 in that. Now, yes. Halfway down the page, you say, asked for dangerous structure engineer DSE was concerned over structure, and then you pick up the briefing with Dave O'Neill, 4 lines up from the bottom, and you say, needed safety, concerned about full or partial collapse, gave him SC safety. That's sector commander safety, I'm assuming.
Yes.
The reference there to full or partial collapse, does that show us that in fact you were concerned about a full collapse of Grenfell Tower?
So I think that might be a summary of the incident as a whole later on, that we had to consider whether a full or a large collapse was possible. I don't think that was when I gave Dave the briefing to take over sector commander safety.
Right.
My expectation is what I'd seen so far. There was no reason to believe a building like that that are normally very solidly built is going to collapse, as it were. So that may be a summary of safety in general, but I don't think it was in the briefing that I gave Dave that I was full collapse was one of my concerns at that point in time. I don't recall that anyway.
Well, it does sit in the briefing note, and I know this is a note and you didn't write it, and it's obviously a record of what was said at the meeting, but it does sit in the context of the briefing that you gave to Dave O'Neill, concerned about full or partial collapse. And so, at least to the reader, it looks as though that was part of your concern which led to the briefing.
If I covered it, I expect I would have said to him, I'm concerned about a partial collapse on the north-east side, and I probably would have said I'm not overly concerned about a full collapse. It wasn't a concern at that point in time that there would have been a pancake-type collapse of the building.
Right.
That wouldn't have been an expectation.
Right.
So however it was noted at the time, I can't recall, but I don't recall thinking with Dave that a full collapse was likely of the building at that point in time.
Can I ask you then to go to your contemporaneous note, which is MET *0005213, and turn to page 3, 4th bullet point down, which is your briefing that you summarise here to Dave O'Neill. And you say, Sector Commander Safety, safety officers particularly on all sides of the building, falling debris on all sides. And then you say, structural integrity for partial or whole building collapse. I felt that Dave was the most experienced officer for USAR, and he was the most suitable officer for this role. When you wrote that, were you recalling that in fact you did have a concern about structural integrity for partial or whole building collapse, and that was what led you to brief Dave O'Neill as safety sector commander?
I recall having a concern about the partial collapse, particularly the north-east side, but I don't recall the concern of the whole building collapse.
So how did it get into your contemporaneous note that you were concerned about whole building collapse?
I mean, that became a concern later on, so whether I confused the issues later on that we started to address. So I had discussions with Dave O'Neill and others when the fire had spread around the outside of the building around the possibility of a total collapse. But I don't recall it at that stage. If I did brief him on it, it's possible, but I don't recall briefing Dave on a total collapse.
So we've got two documents, one done within a week after the fire, which refers to your concern about whole building collapse in the context of briefing Dave O'Neill, and we've got the PRC note similar. Faced with those two, I just wonder whether it's really right to say that you didn't actually brief him on the risk of a whole building collapse at the time.
I don't recall briefing him on a whole building collapse, but...
So are these notes, to the extent that they would suggest that, wrong or misleading?
I definitely recall briefing him on the partial collapse. I don't think I would have covered the whole collapse.
Were you concerned for the safety of the residents and the firefighters in the building as a result of the concerns that we see recorded there, even about partial building collapse?
So my concern on that north-east side was where the cladding was connected, and if you like, the way it's been fixed into the building, it could start to pull out chunks of the building and the impact that might have. Those people on the north-east side are already at huge risk from the fire itself spreading, so it's an additional risk to those people on that north-east side of the building. But there was no reason at that point in time, for example, to be concerned about the stability of the southwest side of the building, which was unaffected, as an example. So yes, if there was a structural issue on that north-east side where the fire was, then that was an additional risk that the occupiers would be faced with.
Did it occur to you at the time that those who were on the north-east side or sector of the building who were at risk not only of fire spread but structural collapse should be told to exit and make their way out.
I don't think it was a concern that there'd be an imminent structural collapse. It was more that if the bolts are if there's chunks of the building being pulled out of the north-east side, in addition to a fire on the north-east side, it was trying to establish how much that would weaken that north-east side of the building, that there could be the risk of some partial collapse occurring.
Right.
But it wasn't something I was expecting to happen immediately.
No.
So where I've seen building fires that have burned severely inside flats before, it can burn it makes the concrete spool away to the point where you see the steel beams exposed, and yet the building's integrity still holds place. I think the concern here may be that if those steel beams are exposed, plus there's been chunks of the concrete outside pulled away as well, I needed to know what the impact of that could be. But at that point, it wasn't I thought there was an imminent collapse or something like that, either partial or whole.
No. But you knew there was a sufficient risk of collapse or partial collapse to summon a DSE. My question is, in the light of your knowledge of that risk, which you acted on, why not tell residents in that sector of the building that stay put no longer applied and they had to get out?
Okay, so calling a DSE on is almost standard practice for a structural building fire a large structural that you're putting firefighters into. So it's almost a standard request along with the gas and electric board. The specific tasks I needed for them, or specific questions, were what type of cladding was this? Did they know more about the cladding, the type of cladding was fitted, because they're also sort of engineers within that field. And then in addition to that, what they thought the impact of it would be, as in how it's attached to the building and then further on from that is what impact will the fire have when it's been burning on the outside of the building for that long. So there was a number of questions for that DSE to answer, and all of those were going through my mind at that point, and that's the person you need to get to answer those questions for you.
Indeed, and given the risks about partial collapse in a part of the building that we've discussed and you've acted on by calling the DSE to assess, how is that consistent with not revoking stay put for the residents in that part of the building?
So I think I needed to know what the risk of the partial collapse possibility was, but I didn't think it was a likelihood that would happen. So we say about risk, I think it was a low risk that actually there would be, because the buildings are built so solidly when they were built, that the chance of a partial collapse is actually unlikely. But I need that confirmed by someone who would have a greater understanding of that than I did at that point in time. So, and again, with regard to individuals who are staying put in unaffected flats, it would come back to still that I'm not expecting a partial collapse of the building. What I need is a DSE to tell me if my thinking is right, that it's unlikely that this building is going to suffer any sort of collapse because of the way they've been built so well.
Yeah. Well, given that you couldn't rule it out until you had advice from a DSE, my question, I'll repeat it one more time, my question is, given that you couldn't rule it out, what was the wisdom of continuing to retain stay put in relation to those residents in the affected part of the building, or potentially affected part of the building?
So the people in the affected part of the building, the north-east side of the building, I'd made the priority to be rescued and evacuated anyway, so they were the people with the fire survival guidance calls. My expectation was they would be a priority along with other people in flats on that north-east side. So without the risk of collapse, the north-east side was still the priority for people to be rescued and evacuated. So it added to it, I suppose, but it didn't mean that there was any additional risk in the short term. So my thought was that any risk of the collapse was going to happen long after the fire, if we hadn't managed to get control of it, would spread further in the building.
And you say that the people on the northeast corner of the building were a priority in terms of responding to the FSG calls. Is that actually so? While you were incident commander, did you actually ever give an instruction to Tom Goodall or Richard Welch or Pat Goulbourne that those callers from that part of the building should be treated as the priority for rescue?
My expectation was that the fire survival guidance call, because the fire was on the north-east side of the building, that is where the fire survival guidance calls were coming from.
Yeah.
When I got to the unit later, it became clear that actually it was beyond just that north-east side. Yeah. So that was in my time of incident commander with the fire spread that I'd seen on the north-east corner. My expectation was that is where the fire survival guidance calls were coming from. At that point, they're just a series of numbers, so we had to confirm that where they were located. But my expectation was that that's where they would be. Later on, when I was operations commander, it became clear that it was more than just the north-east side of the building. Right.
So the answer is you never actually asked anybody or tasked anybody to treat the north-east corner as the priority in terms of rescue? Didn't come to it?
I think within the fire sector, I would have briefed Richard to focus on the fire survival guidance calls, which my understanding would be on the north-east side, and any other flats on. So it's the affected side of the building. So where we can see the fire on the outside, those are the flats you'd want to treat as the priority, along with the fire survival guidance calls.
Now, at the top of page 16 of your witness statement, you say, still on the subject of safety officers, that you say in the second line, I particularly wanted safety officers on the east and north elevations and also on the remaining elevations, so that they also could look out for people at windows. I also wanted to maintain our safe access and egress into the building on the south side. What did you plan to do if the safety officers did see people at windows?
I would expect them to either let me know or enact a rescue that could be carried out, if it's somewhere we could rescue them from. But certainly to get that information back to either the incident commander, or by then we've got a search coordinator and the fire survival guidance unit working. So I expect them to pass that information on to someone.
Right. Is that any windows or windows on the north and east elevations?
So in general, safety officers, what you can use them for as well, is because by the very nature of the job, they are looking at the building that's in front of them. So if they see, they can almost work as a lookout as well for you. So if they see any unusual fire spread, for example, or if they see people that they believe need to be rescued, they can pass that information on either to the incident commander, the operations commander, or to the FSG unit or the search coordinator. So if they're seeing people, I would expect them to pass that information on.
Right. Now, at this point in the night, you're still briefing and giving out sector jobs, if I can put it that way. In terms of rescue, was it your intention that firefighters would only go to the floor to rescue from a specific flat, or would they, while they were on that floor, go around all the other flats and knock on the doors and make sure the occupants were safe, or to tell them to leave as well?
The expectation would normally they go to the flat they've been assigned to, because that's been decided that that's the flat most at risk. If when they got there they thought there was a reason why they would check the other flats, so then they could, and you wouldn't expect them. You have to trust them to use their own initiative as well.
Right.
But you expect them to carry out the task they've been assigned, which is to go to the particular flat they've been sent to.
Given what you could see of the dynamic nature of the fire and the way the fire had behaved in the early stages of the incident, as you'd been told by Mike Dowden, what did you think was the most efficient way to evacuate people in the light of all of that?
So focusing on the fire survival guidance calls first,
Right.
the northeast side of the building then as well, and then from the top floors downwards, because that's where the smoke, if there was smoke inside the building, would start to mushroom at the top of the building and then work its way down.
Right.
And then you would do a floor-by-floor search and evacuation of the whole building.
Now, moving through your role as incident commander, were you aware that crews had told residents they'd gone up into the tower and actually told residents to stay put?
No, I was not there.
We have a number of examples. Let me give you just one. Were you told that an SDBA crew, Foster and Lawson, who tallied out at 2:27, reached floor 18 and told residents to stay put before coming back down to the bridgehead?
I was not aware of that as incident commander, no.
Would that surprise you, that information?
Not knowing the detail of the circumstances, if they've got to the 18th floor and the flat is on the southwest side, and the conditions in the 18th floor were okay in the lobby, I mean, there's no reason why they wouldn't think that those people would be safe where they were. Their expectation would be the same probably as mine, in that the fire shouldn't go horizontally around the building, and that there's no reason why it should breach internally across a lobby and into their flat.
Now, can I ask you to look at page 6 of your contemporaneous note, where you say, in the second main paragraph from the top, I received detailed updates from Richard Welch and Pat Goulbourne on a number of occasions face-to-face within the building. Due to the issues with the radios, I did not try to use the radio for updates, but relied on either face-to-face or MAT/MIC, ORT. The key points they highlighted were, and there's a list of them. When were when was the first of the detailed updates that you refer to there?
That was up as operations commander. So as incident commander, I was asking Dan Merrick if he could, or it might have been another command unit operative when Dan went across to the other unit, if they could get updates from the fire sector or the fire survival guidance sector.
Right.
And they were trying, but there was nothing coming back from either unit. The first piece of information I had back from either unit was a command unit person who brought back the numbers of fire survival guidance calls in progress.
How long elapsed between your briefing Richard Welch and Pat Goulbourne and you being relieved of incident command by Andy Rowe?
It was probably 25 minutes maybe.
Right. During that period, did you get any updates, detailed updates from Richard Welch and Pat Goulbourne?
No, I didn't know.
Right. Did you ask yourself why you hadn't had any detailed updates, or indeed, well, did you get any updates from them during that period?
So I'd asked the command unit operative if they can communicate them and get through to them. When that normally happens at a fire, it means that they are so busy dealing with what's in front of them, they're not getting the time or opportunity to get a message back to the incident commander, and you end up sort of chasing it more and more. And that's what it felt like. And I've experienced that at other fires, so it's not unusual that what you've sent someone out to do a task of, they are so busy with what they're doing, they're not getting the opportunity to get the information they'd like to back to you. Right. And that normally tells you something as well. So with neither unit, well, with neither sector sending back information to me, it was becoming quite clear that what they must be dealing with, which I knew was already significant, was just overwhelming what they were trying to do, and they were not getting the ability to get information back to me.
Right, so you send them out at the beginning, and then 20 to 25 minutes elapses before you're relieved of command by Andy Rowe. Apart from briefing Dave O'Neill, which we've talked about, what else did you do during that period?
So I think Matt Cook and Mick Mulholland appeared during that time as well. They were in the ORT role, so I again asked them what their understanding of the fire was, what my understanding of the fire was, and then asked them if they could. I think I even said to them, I won't be able to get out to the fire for quite a while, so can you get out and assess if what I think is in progress, and then take action if you need to, effectively be my eyes and ears, but almost empowering them to, if they need to put things in place, to do it rather than just come back and tell me what needed to be done. So it's a proactive role in the command.
And did they then leave the CU?
They both left the CU.
And how long elapsed after they left the CU before you were relieved of command by Andy Rowe?
I've got a feeling they were just after Tom Goodall and probably before Pat, so probably 20 minutes maybe.
Right. So once you briefed all the officers and sectorised in the way you've explained, what did you do on the command unit? Well,
there were still more officers, so I had to speak with the police. So I think the police and ambulance, the police probably were around the time that Pat and Dave arrived. So and then the ambulance were probably, I think, just after that. And then there was a number of station managers and watch managers appeared, and in addition to that, Steve West, and then also the command support team. So.
During your time on the command unit, in your role as incident commander, did you receive any kind of feedback or information back from the sector commanders you'd briefed?
No, so from the fire sector and fire survival guidance sector, I kept chasing for information, but it wasn't coming back. So it was becoming clear to me that they must be so busy with the tasks that they're engaged with, they're not getting the opportunity to get information back to me, because I know that they would have wanted to, but they're most likely just so busy dealing with what they've got in front of them that they're not getting the opportunity, until Tom Goodall managed to send across the FSG numbers to me, and so that was the first piece of information, I guess, that came back specifically on that.
Did you say you kept chasing for information? Who were you chasing?
So through the command unit comms operator or team leader at that point, I was asking him to get updates from the fire sector and the fire survival guidance sector. I say keep chasing. It was probably 2 or 3 times I probably asked, is anything coming in from them? If not, can you get hold of them? Which again is normal at an incident. If you're not getting an update, you will, through the command unit team leader or the comms operator, ask them to get updates from those two, from the sectors you've deployed.
So just to break this down, did you ask Dan Merrick, who was the operator on CU8, to get...
Whether it was still Dan Merrick at that point, because Dan had gone across to CU7, so it could have been someone took over from Dan Merrick at that point, around that time.
Do you know who that was?
I'm not sure which one of them it was. So 2 other command unit operatives turned up. One took over from Dan Merrick and one took over from Mark Kempfield as the team leader. So it was one of those. One of those took the radios and one of them took the team leader role.
Okay. And you don't know who they are or were?
I think I recall their names, I just can't remember now. Is it Norman Harrison might be one of them, and I can't remember the other name, sorry.
Does Tony Peckham ring a bell?
It could be Tony Peckham, yes.
All right, I don't want to put...
I'm not certain of that, though.
You're
I
not-
wouldn't have known them by name on the night, so...
Right, but whoever it was, you asked them to get information from the bridgehead, did you?
Yeah, it was the one who'd taken over the comms on the unit, I think was the one I asked to get the update. Right. So that's the one who literally sat in Dan Merrick's seat and took over from him.
Right. Did you, at any stage, seek to speak to control to tell them what you did know?
No. Normally when you communicate with control, you do it through the command unit. That's the normal link you use. You don't normally, as the incident commander, get drawn into speaking to the control as well.
Can I ask you to go to policy FSG, policy 790 FSG? Just tab 3 of the policies bundle and turn to paragraph 9.1. We may come back to this at a later time, but I just want to show it to you and ask you one or two things about it. 9.1 says, it is vital that control is kept informed of the actions being taken to resolve each FSG call. The fact that control is aware of the actions being carried out on the incident ground will greatly enhance the advice given to FSG callers. On the night, were you alive to that requirement
yes.
of policy? You were. And did you do anything to ensure that control was kept aware of the actions being carried out at the incident ground to resolve each FSG call?
So I'd asked Tom when he went out as sector commander for the fire survival guidance to make sure we were in communication with control.
Right.
When I first got onto the FSG unit as operations commander, he pointed to one of the officers, I think it was probably Dan, who was on the phone and actually talking to him, and he said, we've got a two-way conversation going on with Dan speaking to control, and then that information going across to the fire sector and to the bridgehead.
Right. So that's the structure you had in place.
Yep.
Looking at 9.2, informative messages from the incident ground should also contain an update on progress relating to those specific FSG calls by both flat house number to avoid confusion. Did you do anything on the night to ensure that informative messages did contain updates on the progress relating to specific FSG calls?
Not as incident commander, no. I managed to get one informative message away, which detailed the fire as a whole, but I wouldn't have had the time or opportunity to, and the detail at that point, to detail every single FSG call at that point in time.
Right.
But I did manage to get an informative message away.
Yeah, and was that the one at 0242, just before you were relieved of command?
Yes.
Let's just look at that if we can. It's in the short incident log at page 23, at a time mark of 024203. And we can see it there. We'll just look at it. SUP CU8 from DAC O'Loughlin, a residential block of flats, 27 floors, 25 by 25, fire on all floors from 2nd to 27th floor. Large number of persons involved, FSG calls being dealt with. Major incident declared. Do you know whether... well, you say large number of persons involved, FSG calls being dealt with. Did you have any more detail in your head than that?
No, so ideally on the person's reported message, you should specify how many people you know are involved. So if you know there's one person in the house, you would say one person involved. I didn't know the exact numbers of the number of people involved, so the first I could put on there was that large number one. What I needed to find out was a specific number, which came in later. It came in quite soon after.
And how useful would that informative message be, given that you couldn't even give an approximation of the number of FSG calls or their location?
So the primary use of that is to let the firefighters and the officers who are coming onto the fire have an understanding of what they may be dealing with. So until that point, any of the appliances en route would just know they've been ordered to a 40 pump fire. They wouldn't know, and the building obviously, sorry, but they wouldn't specifically know what the fire was. So for those firefighters to know and those officers to know some detail about what it is they're going to be approaching would be the primary use. It's also, of course, a record of what I'm dealing with. But my primary purpose for getting that done as quickly as I could was the oncoming appliances and oncoming officers.
Yeah. Can you just explain, while we're on that message, why you referred or asked the writer of the message to refer to a 27th floor? Did you think there were 27 floors in the building?
So my understanding of it, speaking to Mike, was that it was 24 floors. When I got onto the unit, probably within 5 or 10 minutes, somebody had come on with a plate that looked like it had either been taken from the outside of the building or next to the lift. It's a sort of plate that you see normally for those. And it listed, the flat numbers and where they were within the building.
Yeah.
When I looked at it, it was slightly confusing because at the bottom there were also additional, what looked like floors. So what I wasn't certain of at that point was whether the mezzanine that I saw and that area was additional floors or not with other things. So I think one was a doctor's surgery, one was possibly a child care area, a nursery. So when you looked at it, you saw ground 23rd, which would be the 24 residential floors, and then it wasn't clear if the 2 floors listed underneath were additional floors. How I added those 24 and 2 to 27, I don't know on the night. Right. It was very quick that it happened, but and I remember talking to whoever was on the unit at that point and saying, my understanding is it's 24 floors, but looking at this, it looks like there's more. And so my decision was it could be 27, send the 27, and if we need to change it, we'll change it to 24.
Right. While we're on the subject, and this comes to a question I had for later, but can I ask you to be shown MET 000015644? Is that a building plate?
That is the type of plate. Whether that's the exact one or not, let's have a quick look around.
And
yeah, I'd say that it's definitely a plate that looks like that, whether that's the exact one or not. And so where you can see where it says ground floor, and then you see up to 23, so that was 24. And then what confused me was those 2 underneath. And I probably had 10 seconds to look and think that through. And somehow I added that up to a possibility of 27 floors, even though I'd been told by Mike it was 24. So for me, it was either 24 as Mike had told me, or there wasn't. I added that up to 27, and additional floors. My thoughts were then that was the mezzanine area. So sometimes when flats are converted, they will turn parking areas and things like that into additional flats or other uses. So rather than dwell upon it and try to spend any more time, I just authorised the message to be sent with 27 on the understanding I would change it back to 24 if I got it clarified.
Okay. Well, we'll come back to that plate in another time. Just on your statement, if I can just go to it, it's page 17, halfway down the page. You say, just as that message was completed, someone came onto the CU and handed me a sheet of paper detailing the FSG calls. In my head, I was thinking that we were dealing with double figures, say between 10 and 20 people, perhaps 30 at a push. However, the numbers I was given were 58 adults and 16 children. I was totally shocked. Do you know who gave you that information?
I think it was one of the watch managers from the FSG unit. It could have been a station manager, but I think it was a watch manager. But he had definitely come from the FSG unit. Right.
Do you remember what the sheet of paper looked like? Was it a control information sheet, or was it a firefighter's pad, or
I can't recall. It was on a sheet of paper, and I remember that I then challenged him on it quite strongly because the number just seemed unrealistic in how high it was. And then I wrote it up onto the command unit inside on the board as you walk in. So I can't. It was definitely a piece of paper, but I can't recall the size of the piece of paper.
What did? Do you know where that information came from?
So I asked him. So that was where I was. So because the number was so high, I asked him where that had come from, how he knew it was right. He said it had come from the command unit, and Tom. I think I asked him if Tom knew about it. He said it's come from Tom and the command unit. And I said, how do they know it's that number? And he said they're talking directly to control, and that's the number we've been given. In fact, he was quite strong in the way he was clear to me that is the number, because I was totally surprised by the number.
Did the number of FSGs that you saw on that piece of paper give you any cause for concern as to the strategy that you'd implemented?
That number is an horrendous number to be challenged with. If all of those people are in flats that they can't escape from, then the task of getting to all those people and rescuing them is going to be enormous.
We can identify Piece of paper. Can I ask you to look at MET 000169667, please? Is that familiar?
No, it's not, no. I mean, I may have seen bits of paper on the night that looked like that, but no, this was, I'm sure it's just a piece of paper that just said the 58 adults and 16 children. I don't recall anything else being on it.
Oh, I see.
Yeah, it was just specific. That's all I recall being on there. Was
it wasn't a list, it was a
No, it was
total.
a specific number of that. I didn't add them up or anything. He just gave me that number of people on a piece of paper. And I remember thinking that, you know, I needed to confirm that was a correct number.
Did you think that fighting the fire, having seen that information, was still a viable option at that time?
By that time, I hadn't had a briefing on the extent of the fire. One of the most important things I needed to do at that point was get to the fire sector and find out a briefing of where progress was. You're always likely to have to fight the fire, whether it's to protect crews who are trying to get in or out of the building, or if when they get to a flat it is on fire, and they need to get into that flat. So there was no thought that we would just be able to stop firefighting at some point. We'd always have to carry out some sort of firefighting operations, but at the same time we're going to have to carry out rescue operations in addition to that.
Right. Do you remember what you did with that piece of paper?
I don't think I took the piece of paper. I wrote it up on the whiteboard. I expect the watch manager must have kept it, but I wrote the number up on the whiteboard in, I think, the top left-hand corner of the unit. On the board right in front of you, but in the top left-hand corner of that board.
Now, this was just after you sent your message at 2:42:03, so this is very much towards the end of your time.
Yes.
As incident commander. Did you relay that information to Richard Welch or Pat Goulbourne as an update to them?
I recall I got it sent as a message. I can't recall whether I told the comms operator to send that across to the fire sector or not as well. But within a minute of that, I think Andy had come on. So it's likely that I would have asked for that to be done, but I can't recall that, if I did or not.
We don't... Yeah, if you go to page 23 of the short incident log, we can see that at 2:42:50, we can see that Sharon Darby puts out an informative SUP CU8, 58 adults and 16 children believed involved, tactical mode Oscar. Is that the message you're referring to? Yeah,
so the watch manager had been on. I probably spent about 30 seconds challenging him as to the accuracy of that number because it was so high and where it had come from. And when he was very strong in his response saying it was definitely the right number, that's when I turned to the comms operator and asked him to send that as well. And obviously at the same time, or around the same time, I wrote it up on the board. And then within a very short amount of time, Andy Rowe got onto the unit.
Right. And having received that piece of information and knowing now that the task you faced was, as you just said, enormous, did you then have any thoughts about whether to revoke the stay put policy in whole or in part for this building?
Well, that in particular is the fire survival guidance call, so they are still the people who are in the affected flats. I think my surprise was, with the fire being on the north-east side of the building at the point I'd seen it, what you have on that side of the building and potentially elsewhere in the building is 58 adults and 16 children. They're still the primary focus to try to get to. So again, people who are in unaffected flats at that point in time, there was still possibly no reason to believe they wouldn't be safe in their unaffected flats. But what I did need was a clear briefing on how the fire had progressed since I had last seen it.
Yes, thank you. Mr. O'Loughlin, we've come to 4:30, and Mr. Chairman also, we've come to 4:30, as you can tell. I haven't finished, I'm afraid, my questions for this witness. It's regrettable, but it is what it is. I'm afraid I am going to have to ask you to ask the witness to come back tomorrow morning if that's not inconvenient.
Yes, of course, sir.
Well, I'm sorry we have to ask you to do that, but as Mr. Millett says, there are more questions he'd like to ask you, so I'm afraid I have to do that. Can you give us any indication of how long you might be, Mr. Millett?
Yes, I can. would be no more than 1.5 hours, including an estimated time to take any further questions at the end in the usual way as we have been. I noticed the chairman-like eyebrows going up, and I'm sorry about that. But
well, sometimes over the adjournment you can
sometimes
find it's possible to reduce the number of questions. But
yes,
obviously you have to ask all the questions that you have to ask, and you have to follow the leads that need to be followed.
Yes.
So,
well, I'm afraid we are where we are. I'm sorry about that. I don't think it's going to impact the timetable in the medium term.
right.
But may I ask if we have a 9:30 start tomorrow morning? It's an unusual application, I know, but that would certainly help us.
Yes. Well, Mr. Loughlin, would it inconvenience you to start at 9:30 tomorrow?
No, that's fine, sir.
You sure?
Yes, sir.
Yes, all right. Well, in that case, yes, I think we'd better start early. We're obviously not doing as well today as we'd hoped in terms of getting through your evidence. So I'm going to ask you to come back tomorrow to resume at 9:30, if you wouldn't mind. And while you're away from the inquiry, please don't discuss your evidence or anything to do with it with anyone else.
Yes, sir.
All right?
Yes,
Well, thank you very much indeed. We'd like to go with the usher now.
Thank you.
Right, 9:30 tomorrow then, please.